Hello everyone, welcome to The Missing Link. In tonight's mystery, we're exploring the truth about the Radium girls, young women who painted glowing watch dials with radium, never knowing the poison they were ingesting until their bodies began to break down from the inside out. It's one of those stories that leaves more questions than answers. And tonight, you'll hear it all. So before you get comfortable, let us know where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. Now, lie back, listen closely, and drift off as the mystery unfolds. In the summer of 1917, Catherine Wiley stepped through the factory doors of the United States Radium Corporation in Orange, New Jersey, clutching her employment letter with trembling fingers. At 19, she had never imagined that her penmanship skills would land her such a coveted position. The war effort demanded precision workers, and dial painting paid better than most jobs for young women. The factory floor buzzed with activity. Rows of women sat hunched over workbenches, their faces illuminated by the ethereal green glow emanating from small glass vials. Catherine had never seen anything quite so beautiful. The radium paint seemed to capture moonlight itself, holding it prisoner in each tiny brushstroke applied to watch faces destined for soldiers overseas. Mrs. Margaret Carlo, the floor supervisor, appeared beside Catherine's shoulder. Her breath carried the metallic scent that Catherine would later recognize as Radium's signature calling card. "Welcome to the most important work a young lady can do for her country," Mrs. Carlo announced, gesturing toward an empty station. "Each timepiece you paint might save a soldier's life in the trenches. They need to read their watches in complete darkness." The instructions seemed simple enough. Dip the camel hairbrush in radium paint, point the tip between your lips to achieve the finest possible line, then carefully trace the numerals on each watch dial. The technique, known as lip pointing, had been perfected by experienced workers who could complete a watch face in mere minutes. Catherine watched Grace Fryer, a seasoned dial painter, demonstrate the method with practiced ease. "The taste takes some getting used to," Grace admitted, wiping her lips with the back of her hand. A faint luminescent residue remained on her skin, but you'll hardly notice it after a few days. Some of the girls even say it's rather pleasant, slightly sweet with a mineral finish. Catherine's first attempt proved clumsy. The brush felt unwieldy between her lips, and the paint seemed to resist her guidance. Mrs. Carlo observed patiently before offering encouragement. "Don't worry, dear. Yesterday's new girl is already painting 12 watches an hour. The company pays 5 cents per completed dial, so your earnings depend entirely on your speed and accuracy." The mathematics appealed to Catherine's practical nature. If she could match the productivity of experienced workers, she might earn more in a week than her father made in a month at the textile mill. The war had created unprecedented opportunities for women willing to master specialized skills. As the afternoon progressed, Catherine found her rhythm. The radium paint began to feel familiar on her tongue, and her brushstrokes grew more confident. Around her, conversations flowed freely among the workers. They discussed everything from the latest motion pictures to their brothers and sweethearts fighting in France. "Have you noticed how our clothes glow after work?" asked Molly Maggia, a petite brunette who had been with the company for nearly 2 years. She held up her apron, which indeed seemed to emit a faint luminescence in the factory's shadowed corners. "Sometimes I can read by my own light when I get home. My little sister thinks I'm magical." The women laughed at this revelation, comparing their glowing fingernails and hair. Some had begun wearing their best dresses to work, delighting in how the radium dust transformed ordinary fabric into something otherworldly. They called themselves the Ghost Girls and took pride in their unique appearance. Catherine soon discovered that the luminous effects extended beyond mere clothing. Her teeth had acquired a subtle gleam that made her smile particularly striking in dim light. Her mother initially expressed concern, but Catherine assured her that the company's medical examinations had found all the workers in perfect health. Dr. Cecil Drinker, who occasionally visited the factory to observe operations, had even complimented the women on their robust appearance. He mentioned that radium was being used in various health tonics and cosmetics, suggesting that their daily exposure might actually provide beneficial effects. Several society women in New York had begun paying substantial sums for radium treatments at exclusive spas. The work environment fostered a sense of camaraderie that Catherine had never experienced. The women shared lunches, celebrated birthdays, and discussed their dreams for the future. Many hoped to save enough money to attend secretarial school or help their families purchase homes. The war had created a temporary window of economic opportunity that none wanted to waste. As autumn approached, Catherine had mastered the lip pointing technique and consistently painted 20 watches per hour. Her weekly earnings exceeded those of most men in her neighborhood, and she took pride in contributing significantly to her family's income. The mysterious green glow had become as familiar as daylight, and she couldn't imagine working anywhere else. Yet subtle changes had begun to manifest among some of the longer-term employees. Grace Fryer occasionally complained of jaw pain, and Molly Maggia had developed an unusual fatigue that seemed unrelated to the demanding work schedule. Catherine noticed these developments, but attributed them to the natural stresses of wartime employment. The radium paint continued to fascinate her. Each brushstroke seemed to capture starlight, and she marveled at the scientific breakthrough that made such illumination possible. Marie Curie's discovery had revolutionized industry and medicine, and Catherine felt honored to participate in its practical application. By the spring of 1918, the United States Radium Corporation had expanded its operations considerably. The factory now employed over 200 women, working in shifts around the clock to meet military contracts. Catherine Wiley had become one of the most productive dial painters, earning recognition from management and the respect of her colleagues. However, disturbing patterns had begun to emerge among the workforce. Molly Maggia, once the most vivacious worker on the floor, had developed a persistent cough that echoed through the factory halls. Her complexion, previously radiant with health, had taken on a grayish pallor that concerned her fellow workers. "It's just the spring weather," Molly insisted when Catherine expressed worry. "My mother always said the changing seasons affect some people more than others." Yet her voice had grown hoarse, and she frequently paused during conversations to catch her breath. Grace Fryer had also begun experiencing unusual symptoms. Her jaw ached constantly, particularly when she awakened in the morning. The company nurse, Miss Davies, suggested that Grace might be grinding her teeth due to the concentration required for detailed work. She recommended a nightly mouth guard and advised Grace to chew gum during her breaks to exercise the jaw muscles. Catherine found herself studying her colleagues more carefully. She noticed that several women who had worked at the factory for over 18 months displayed similar characteristics. Their energy levels had declined noticeably, and they seemed to tire more easily during the demanding workdays. Some complained of mysterious bone pain that seemed to migrate throughout their bodies. The company's response to these health concerns remained consistently reassuring. Dr. Stanford, the industrial physician who conducted monthly examinations, emphasized that radium was being prescribed by leading medical professionals for various ailments. He cited recent articles in medical journals that praised radium's therapeutic properties for treating arthritis, tuberculosis, and other conditions. "You ladies are receiving the equivalent of expensive medical treatments simply by performing your patriotic duties," Dr. Stanford explained during one of his visits. "Some wealthy patients pay hundreds of dollars for radium therapy that you receive naturally through your work environment." Catherine wanted to believe these explanations, but her observational skills had sharpened during her months at the factory. She began keeping private notes about the changes she witnessed among her colleagues. The documentation started innocently enough, merely recording who seemed tired or complained of specific symptoms. The most troubling development involved Molly Maggia's teeth. What had begun as minor jaw discomfort had progressed to serious dental problems. 2 of her molars had become loose, and her dentist expressed bewilderment about the condition. He had never encountered a tooth deterioration of such severity in such a young, otherwise healthy patient. Molly tried to maintain her characteristic optimism, but the pain had begun affecting her work performance. She could no longer point her brush between her lips without experiencing sharp discomfort. Mrs. Carla reluctantly assigned her to mixing paint, a position that paid less but required minimal lip contact with the brush. Catherine also noticed changes in her body, though she initially dismissed them as insignificant. Her fingernails had become brittle, breaking easily despite her careful attention to hand care. More concerning was a persistent metallic taste that had developed over the past month. Even her favorite foods seemed to carry an underlying mineral flavor. The social dynamics among the workers had begun to shift as well. Those experiencing health problems formed informal support groups, sharing remedies and comparing symptoms. Newer employees, such as Catherine, struggled to balance their loyalty to longtime colleagues with their fear of jeopardizing their own positions by acknowledging the problems. Miss Sarah Mylifer developed an unusual rash on her hands and forearms just 2 months after she started working at the factory with Catherine. The company nurse suggested she might be allergic to the soap used in the washrooms, but the condition persisted despite switching to different cleansing products. Catherine began to research radium independently, spending her evenings at the public library reading scientific journals and medical texts. The information she discovered proved contradictory. While some sources praised radium's therapeutic applications, others mentioned potential hazards associated with excessive exposure. One article particularly caught her attention. A researcher in Europe had reported cases of radium poisoning among scientists working with radioactive materials. The symptoms described in the study matched many of the problems she had observed among her colleagues: anemia, bone pain, dental deterioration, and progressive weakness. When Catherine mentioned this research to Grace Fryer, her friend's reaction surprised her. Grace admitted that she had also been conducting private investigations into radium's effects. Together, they began to document their observations more systematically, creating a detailed record of health changes among the factory workers. Their informal study revealed disturbing patterns. Women who had worked at the factory longest showed the most severe symptoms. Those who painted the most watches per day, requiring frequent lip pointing, seemed particularly affected. The correlation between exposure duration and health problems appeared undeniable. Catherine faced a troubling dilemma. She needed her job to support her family, and the work had provided financial security beyond her previous dreams. Yet the evidence suggested that continued exposure to radium might be harming her health and that of her colleagues. The company's medical authorities continued to insist that radium posed no dangers, but their reassurances rang increasingly hollow. The mystery deepened when Catherine learned that several former employees had left the factory due to illness. When she attempted to contact these women, she discovered that some had died from conditions that their doctors could not adequately explain. The company had not informed current employees about these deaths, and Catherine began to suspect that management might be deliberately concealing important information. The devastating news of summer 1918 rocked the foundation of Catherine Wiley's meticulously crafted world. Molly Maggia, the spirited young woman who had welcomed Catherine to the factory floor just 1 year earlier, had died at the age of 24. The official cause of death listed syphilis, a diagnosis that outraged those who knew Molly's character and moral standards. Catherine stood in the cemetery beside Grace Fryer and a dozen other dial painters, watching as Molly's coffin was lowered into the ground. The funeral director had mentioned something peculiar to Molly's sister. The body seemed to emit a faint glow, even in death. This detail was whispered among the mourners, but never officially acknowledged. Dr. Barry, who had attended Molly during her final weeks, privately expressed doubts about the syphilis diagnosis. He confided to Molly's family that he had never encountered such extensive bone deterioration and jaw necrosis in any syphilis patient. Her jawbone had literally crumbled in his hands during examination, yet other symptoms typical of the disease were entirely absent. The factory management's response to Molly's death proved coldly bureaucratic. Mrs. Carlo announced that while the company regretted the loss, medical experts had confirmed that her illness bore no relation to her employment. Workers were reminded that radium exposure remained perfectly safe and that their medical examinations continued to show normal results. Catherine had begun to question the reliability of these medical examinations. The company physicians seemed to focus exclusively on weight measurements and general appearance while ignoring specific complaints about jaw pain, fatigue, and dental problems. Often, the company physicians dismissed workers who mentioned concerning symptoms by suggesting better nutrition or increased exercise. Grace Fryer had grown increasingly militant about the situation. She began organizing informal meetings among the workers to discuss their health concerns and share information. These gatherings took place away from the factory, usually in someone's home or at a local church social hall. Catherine initially hesitated to attend, fearing repercussions from management, but her loyalty to her colleagues eventually overcame her caution. During one such meeting, the women compiled a disturbing inventory of health problems. Edna Hussman reported that her teeth were loosening and that her jaw ached constantly. Quinta MacDonald described mysterious anemia that left her exhausted despite adequate rest and nutrition. Albina Larice had developed a limp due to unexplained hip pain that worsened each month. The pattern became undeniable when they compared notes systematically. Every woman who had worked at the factory for more than 6 months reported some combination of dental problems, bone pain, anemia, or mysterious rashes. The longest employed women displayed the most severe symptoms. The correlation between duration of employment and illness severity could not be explained as coincidence. Catherine's own health had begun to deteriorate more noticeably. Her menstrual periods had become irregular, and she experienced frequent headaches that seemed unrelated to stress or fatigue. Most disturbing was the persistent metallic taste that had intensified to the point where food had lost much of its appeal. She had lost 12 pounds over the past 3 months, despite maintaining her usual diet. The women decided to seek independent medical opinions from physicians not affiliated with the United States Radium Corporation. Dr. Theodore Blum, a dentist in Newark, agreed to examine several of the workers without charge. His findings proved alarming and would later contribute to medical literature under the term radium jaw. Dr. Blum discovered extensive bone necrosis in every patient he examined. The jawbones showed signs of progressive deterioration that he had never encountered in his decades of practice. He documented his findings meticulously, noting that the bone damage appeared to radiate outward from the areas of greatest radium concentration. When Dr. Blum attempted to contact the company's medical staff to discuss his findings, he encountered surprising resistance. The company physicians questioned his qualifications and suggested that the patient's psychological expectations might bias his examinations. They maintained that extensive research had proven radium's safety and that isolated cases of illness could not be attributed to workplace exposure. Catherine began to research the backgrounds of the company's medical advisors. She discovered that several had financial interests in radium-related businesses and that their opinions might not be entirely objective. This revelation reinforced her increasing belief that the company was purposefully misleading the workers about the risks associated with their employment. Some workers reported pressure from company representatives to refrain from seeking outside medical attention, further complicating the situation. Supervisors suggested that discussing health problems with unauthorized physicians might be considered disloyal to the war effort. The company reminded some workers that sharing information about factory operations might violate confidentiality clauses in defense contracts. Grace Fryer had grown increasingly frustrated with the company's evasive responses to their concerns. She began contacting former employees who had left due to illness, attempting to document the full scope of the health crisis. Many of these women reported that their conditions had continued to deteriorate even after leaving the factory, suggesting that radium exposure might cause permanent damage. The mystery deepened when Catherine learned about similar problems at radium dial factories in other locations. Workers in Ottawa, Illinois, and Waterbury, Connecticut had reported health issues identical to those experienced in Orange, New Jersey. The consistency of symptoms across different facilities suggested a systemic problem rather than isolated incidents. Catherine faced an increasingly difficult choice. Her family depended on her income, and factory jobs remained scarce for young women without extensive education. Yet continuing to work at the United States Radium Corporation might be slowly killing her. The glowing paint that had once seemed so beautiful now appeared sinister. each brushstroke potentially adding to her accumulated exposure to a substance that might be destroying her body from within. The war had ended, but the battle for the truth about radium exposure was just beginning. Catherine realized that she and her colleagues might need to challenge not only their employer, but also the medical establishment and possibly the government itself to protect their health and ensure that other young women would not face similar dangers. By the autumn of 1919, Catherine Wiley had transformed from an eager young worker into an amateur detective, methodically documenting evidence of what appeared to be a systematic cover-up. The United States Radium Corporation initiated new policies that appeared to shield workers from uncovering the truth about their declining health. The company had installed new ventilation systems and required workers to use different brushes, claiming these changes would improve efficiency. However, Catherine noticed that management personnel had begun wearing protective equipment when visiting the factory floor, while workers continued their daily exposure without any protective measures. This discrepancy raised disturbing questions about what company officials actually knew about radium's dangers. Dr. Cecil Drinker returned to the factory that autumn to conduct what he described as a routine industrial hygiene study. Catherine observed his visit carefully, noting that he spent considerable time measuring air quality and collecting samples from work surfaces. His demeanor seemed more serious than during previous visits, and he asked pointed questions about worker health that suggested genuine concern rather than routine inquiry. When Dr. Drinker's report was completed several months later, the company refused to share its contents with employees. Through a contact at the local health department, Catherine learned that the study had identified significant safety hazards and recommended immediate implementation of protective measures. Yet workers received no information about these findings or the recommended changes. Grace Fryer had continued organizing meetings among affected workers, and their informal network had grown to include women from factories in other states. Through correspondence and occasional visits, they had documented identical health problems among radium dial painters throughout the country. The consistency of symptoms across different locations strengthened their conviction that radium exposure was causing their illnesses. The legal implications of their situation became clearer when Catherine contacted attorney Leonard Grossman, who specialized in workplace injury cases. Grossman's initial assessment proved sobering. He explained that proving corporate liability for occupational illness required extensive medical evidence and expert testimony that might be difficult to obtain. Companies typically argued that worker health problems resulted from pre-existing conditions or lifestyle factors unrelated to employment. Grossman also warned that the radium industry wielded considerable political influence due to its importance for national defense and medical applications. Challenging such companies would require substantial financial resources and the willingness to endure prolonged legal battles against well-funded opponents. Many attorneys would be reluctant to accept cases with uncertain outcomes against powerful corporate interests. Catherine's personal health continued to deteriorate despite her efforts to minimize exposure by avoiding the lip-pointing technique. Her anemia had worsened to the point where climbing stairs left her breathless, and her bone pain had become constant. Most troubling was the discovery of several loose teeth, a development that filled her with dread given what had happened to Molly Maggia. The company's response to worker health complaints had become increasingly defensive and legalistic. When Edna Hussman collapsed at her workstation due to severe anemia, company representatives suggested that her condition might be related to poor nutrition or personal habits rather than workplace exposure. They emphasized that medical examinations continued to show that most workers remained healthy. Catherine began to suspect that the company's medical examinations were deliberately designed to avoid detecting radium-related illness. The physicians focused on general appearance and weight while ignoring specific symptoms that workers reported. Blood tests were rarely performed, and dental examinations were not included in the standard screening protocol. Through her library research, Catherine discovered disturbing information about the radium industry's knowledge of health hazards. Scientific papers published in European journals described cases of radium poisoning among researchers and industrial workers. Some of these studies had been available for several years, suggesting that American companies might have been aware of potential dangers long before problems emerged among dial painters. The most damning evidence came from internal company documents that Catherine obtained through a sympathetic clerk in the corporate offices. These papers revealed that executives had discussed worker health problems in private correspondence while publicly maintaining that radium exposure was perfectly safe. The documents suggested a deliberate strategy to minimize legal liability by avoiding acknowledgement of workplace hazards. Catherine shared these discoveries with Grace Fryer and their growing network of affected workers. Despite the difficulties they would encounter, the evidence made them more determined to take legal action. They realized that their case might establish important precedents for workplace safety and corporate responsibility that could protect future generations of workers. The women decided to seek additional medical evidence by consulting independent specialists who had no financial ties to the radium industry. Dr. Harrison Martland, a pathologist at Newark City Hospital, agreed to examine several of the workers and conduct laboratory tests to determine whether their bodies contained elevated levels of radioactive materials. Dr. Martland's findings provided the scientific foundation they needed to challenge the company's claims. His tests revealed that the workers' bodies contained significant amounts of radium that continued to emit radiation years after their initial exposure. The radioactive material had accumulated in their bones and organs, causing ongoing cellular damage that explained their progressive health deterioration. Armed with this medical evidence, Catherine and her colleagues began preparing for what would become one of the most important workplace safety cases in American legal history. They understood that their battle would require not only legal expertise, but also public support to overcome the powerful interests arrayed against them. The glowing paint that had once seemed miraculous now represented betrayal and corporate callousness. Catherine realized that her personal struggle for justice had evolved into something much larger, a fight to establish the principle that workers had the right to know about workplace hazards and to receive protection from employers who prioritize profits over human safety. The conspiracy of silence that had protected the radium industry was beginning to crack, but Catherine knew that exposing the truth would require courage, persistence, and sacrifices that would test her resolve in ways she had never imagined. Dr. Harrison Martland's laboratory at Newark City Hospital became the epicenter of groundbreaking research that would revolutionize understanding of occupational radiation exposure. Catherine Wiley found herself at the forefront of medical history as one of the first documented cases of chronic radium poisoning in industrial workers. The pathologist's investigations required Catherine and her colleagues to undergo extensive testing procedures that were both invasive and emotionally challenging. Dr. Martland collected blood samples, bone marrow specimens, and tissue biopsies to document the physiological changes caused by radium exposure. Each test revealed additional evidence of the systematic damage that radioactive materials had inflicted on their bodies. The most dramatic demonstration of their contamination occurred when Dr. Martland used a newly developed instrument called an electroscope to measure the radioactivity present in their bodies. Catherine watched in fascination and horror as the device detected significant radiation levels in her breath, saliva, and even her clothing. The measurements proved that she had become a living source of radioactive contamination. Dr. Martland documented his findings with meticulous care, recognizing that his research would face intense scrutiny from the radium industry and skeptical medical colleagues. He photographed bone deterioration, recorded blood count abnormalities, and measured radiation levels with unprecedented precision. His laboratory notes would eventually become crucial evidence in legal proceedings against the United States Radium Corporation. The pathologist's research revealed that radium behaved differently in the human body than previously understood. Rather than being quickly eliminated like most foreign substances, radioactive radium accumulated in bone tissue where it continued to emit radiation for years. This internal contamination caused progressive damage to blood-forming organs and bone structure that explained the worker's deteriorating health. Catherine learned that her body would continue to be radioactive for the rest of her life. Dr. Martland explained that radium had a half-life of over 1,500 years, meaning that the radioactive material in her bones would remain dangerous for millennia. This revelation transformed her understanding of her situation from a temporary health crisis to a permanent condition that would affect her for decades. The scientific implications of Dr. Martland's research extended far beyond the immediate case of the dial painters. His work provided the first comprehensive documentation of chronic radiation exposure in humans, establishing principles that would later guide radiation safety regulations in nuclear industries. The tragic experience of Catherine and her colleagues contributed to knowledge that would protect future generations of workers. Dr. Martland's findings attracted attention from researchers around the world who recognized the significance of his discoveries. International medical journals began publishing his studies, and scientists from various countries requested additional information about the dial painters' cases. Catherine realized that her personal struggle had become part of a global effort to understand radiation's effects on human health. The company's response to Dr. Martland's research proved predictably hostile. Corporate attorneys attempted to discredit his methodology and question his qualifications, despite his impeccable credentials and careful documentation. They argued that his findings might be influenced by bias toward the workers or desire for publicity rather than objective scientific inquiry. Industry representatives also challenged the connection between workplace exposure and worker illness, suggesting that the health problems might result from other factors. They cited medical opinions from company-affiliated physicians who maintained that radium exposure remained safe within established limits. These conflicting expert opinions created confusion that benefited the company's legal position. Catherine began to understand the broader implications of her case for industrial medicine and worker protection. The legal system's traditional approach to occupational illness required workers to prove that their employers had been negligent or had violated established safety standards. However, radium's dangers had been largely unknown when she began working at the factory, complicating efforts to establish corporate liability. Dr. Martland's research also revealed disturbing information about the company's knowledge of radium hazards. His investigation uncovered evidence that corporate officials had been aware of potential health risks much earlier than they had publicly acknowledged. Internal documents suggested that safety precautions had been implemented for executives and laboratory personnel, while production workers continued their exposure without protection. The pathologist's work attracted support from other medical professionals who recognized the importance of his research. Dr. Alice Hamilton, a pioneer in occupational medicine, praised his scientific rigor and endorsed his conclusions about radium's dangers. Her support lent credibility to the workers' claims and helped counter industry attempts to discredit the research. Catherine found herself becoming an advocate for industrial safety reform beyond her personal legal case. She began speaking to women's organizations and labor groups about the importance of workplace health protection. Her first-hand experience with corporate deception and medical cover-ups gave her testimony emotional power that resonated with audiences concerned about worker welfare. The scientific evidence accumulated by Dr. Martland provided the foundation for broader reforms in industrial hygiene and occupational medicine. His work demonstrated the need for independent medical monitoring of workers exposed to potentially hazardous materials and established principles for evaluating long-term health effects of industrial chemicals. Catherine's transformation from naive factory worker to informed advocate reflected broader changes in American society's understanding of industrial responsibility and worker rights. Her case would contribute to legal precedents that expanded corporate liability for occupational illness and established workers' rights to information about workplace hazards. The glowing legacy of her exposure to radium had evolved from personal tragedy to scientific breakthrough that would protect countless future workers from similar dangers. Catherine began to see her suffering as meaningful if it prevented other young women from experiencing the deception and health destruction that she and her colleagues had endured.
Harold Weatherby had been tracking storm patterns for the National Weather Service for 37 years. But nothing had prepared him for what he discovered in the archived barometric readings from November 24, 1971. The data should have been routine: pressure measurements, wind velocity, precipitation levels. But buried within the meteorological records was an anomaly that made his coffee grow cold as he stared at his computer screen. The wind patterns that Thanksgiving Eve told a story that contradicted everything the FBI had concluded about the Cooper case. According to Harold's calculations, the downdrafts and crosswinds between Portland and Seattle would have made it impossible for anyone to land where the Bureau claimed Cooper had jumped. The man who called himself Dan Cooper hadn't vanished into the wilderness as everyone believed. He had landed in a completely different location. Harold's weathered hands trembled as he cross-referenced the atmospheric conditions with topographical maps. The convergence of wind patterns created a natural funnel effect that would have carried a parachutist southeast, not southwest. This meant Cooper had landed in a completely different county, possibly even a different state. For over 50 years, search efforts, speculation, and countless theories had concentrated on the wrong geographic area. The revelation struck Harold with the force of a lightning bolt. He had stumbled upon evidence that could rewrite history. But as he reached for his phone to call the FBI, something made him pause. The timestamp on the meteorological data showed it had been accessed multiple times over the decades, always by the same government identification number. Someone else knew about the wind patterns. Someone had been actively suppressing this information. Harold's heart pounded as he realized the implications. The Cooper case wasn't just unsolved, it was deliberately kept that way. The mystery that had captivated America for generations was a carefully constructed facade. But why? What was so important about maintaining the illusion that Cooper had disappeared into the Washington wilderness? As he investigated the archived files, Harold discovered a pattern of data manipulation that extended far beyond simple meteorological readings. Flight manifests had been altered, witness testimonies had been redacted, and physical evidence had been systematically reclassified. The Cooper case was not merely a mishandled robbery, but rather a massive cover-up. The realization that he was now privy to dangerous information settled over Harold like a shroud. His discovery had the potential to reveal a conspiracy spanning across the highest echelons of government, but it also positioned him as a potential target. The same forces that had kept Cooper's true fate hidden for half a century wouldn't hesitate to silence an elderly meteorologist who had stumbled upon their secret. Harold's mind raced as he considered his options. He could pretend he had never seen the data, delete his research, and return to his quiet retirement. Or he could follow the evidence wherever it led, knowing that the truth about D.B. Cooper might cost him everything. The weight of 5 decades of deception pressed down on him as he made his choice. He began copying the files to an encrypted drive, his movements quick and efficient despite his age. If something happened to him, at least the evidence would survive. The truth about Cooper's sky heist wasn't just about a man who jumped from a plane. It was about a conspiracy that had shaped American history in ways no one could imagine. As Harold worked through the night, digitizing decades of suppressed evidence, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. The same instinct that had kept him alive through tornado seasons and hurricane tracking now screamed warnings about the storm he was about to unleash. The Cooper case was about to be blown wide open, and Harold Weatherby was standing at the epicenter of a revelation that would shake the foundations of everything America thought it knew about that fateful Thanksgiving Eve in 1971. Margaret Chen had been working as a senior analyst at the Department of Justice for 23 years when the encrypted file arrived in her secure inbox. The sender was identified only as barometric truth, but the meteorological data contained within shattered everything she thought she knew about the Cooper investigation. As she studied Harold Weatherby's research, Margaret realized she was looking at evidence of a conspiracy that reached into the heart of the federal government. The implications were staggering. When Margaret compared Harold's wind pattern analysis with the government's internal reports, she discovered a clear deception. The FBI hadn't simply failed to solve the case. They had actively worked to ensure it remained unsolved. The question that haunted Margaret was why. Her security clearance granted her access to Operation Northwood's documents, Project Blue Book files, and other classified materials that most Americans would never see. But the Cooper files were different. They were compartmentalized beyond normal classification levels, restricted to a select group of officials who had maintained their silence for over 5 decades. Margaret's attempts to access the complete files triggered automatic alerts that would certainly draw unwanted attention. Working carefully within the system, Margaret began to piece together the true scope of the Cooper cover-up. The hijacking hadn't been a random act of desperation or a well-planned robbery. It had been a carefully orchestrated operation designed to conceal something far more significant. The man who called himself Dan Cooper was no ordinary skyjacker. He was a government operative whose mission had gone catastrophically wrong. The deeper Margaret dug, the more she realized that Cooper's jump from Flight 305 had been an extraction, not an escape. The parachutes, the money, and the meticulous planning all indicated a professional operation with government backing. But something had gone wrong during the extraction, something that required the creation of an elaborate mythology to explain Cooper's disappearance. Margaret's investigation unearthed a series of personnel files sealed since 1971. The files held the records of deep-cover operatives engaged in classified projects during the Cold War. One name stood out: Daniel B. Cooper, a CIA operative who had been declared killed in action 3 days before the hijacking. The timing was too convenient to be coincidental. The revelation that Cooper, a government agent, had supposedly died before the hijacking suggested a level of deception that left Margaret feeling uneasy. The entire Cooper mythology had been constructed to hide the fact that a CIA operative had gone rogue and disappeared with classified information that could have compromised national security. The money from the hijacking was never the real prize. It was the intelligence Cooper had stolen that made him so dangerous. Margaret's hands shook as she realized the full scope of what she had uncovered. The Cooper case wasn't just about a man who jumped from a plane. It was about a rogue operative who had potentially sold state secrets to foreign governments. The cover-up had been necessary to prevent a scandal that could have brought down the CIA and exposed decades of illegal domestic operations. As she compiled her findings, Margaret became aware that her investigation had not gone unnoticed. Her computer access logs showed unusual activity, and she had the distinct feeling that she was being watched. The same security apparatus that had kept the Cooper secret for 50 years was now focused on her. She was playing a dangerous game against opponents who had perfected the art of making problems disappear. The weight of her discovery pressed down on Margaret as she realized that she held the key to one of America's greatest mysteries. But she also understood that revealing the truth could destroy her career, her life, and possibly her existence. The forces that had maintained the Cooper cover-up for half a century wouldn't hesitate to eliminate anyone who threatened to expose their carefully constructed lie. Margaret made a decision that would define the rest of her life. She would follow the evidence wherever it led, knowing that the truth about D.B. Cooper was worth the risk. The American people deserved to know that their government had been lying to them for 50 years, and Margaret Chen was prepared to pay the price for bringing that truth to light. Dr. Elena Vasquez had built her reputation on precision. As a theoretical physicist specializing in ballistics and trajectory analysis, she had consulted on everything from missile defense systems to accident reconstruction. When Harold Weatherby's meteorological data reached her through encrypted channels, Elena immediately recognized the significance of what she was seeing. The wind patterns told a story that contradicted 50 years of accepted wisdom about the Cooper case. Elena's laboratory at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology became the unlikely center of a historical investigation that would challenge everything America believed about its most famous mystery. Using advanced computational models and atmospheric simulation software, she began to reconstruct the exact conditions that Dan Cooper would have encountered during his jump from Flight 305. The calculations were complex, requiring Eleanor to factor in variables that the original FBI investigation had either ignored or misunderstood. Air density, thermal layers, wind shear, and gravitational effects all played crucial roles in determining where Cooper would have landed. But as Elena's simulations ran through thousands of iterations, one conclusion became inescapable. Cooper had not landed in the Washington wilderness where the search had been concentrated. The trajectory analysis revealed that Cooper's landing zone was actually in northeastern Oregon, approximately 60 miles from where the FBI had focused their investigation. This wasn't a minor miscalculation. It was a fundamental error that suggested either gross incompetence or deliberate misdirection. Eleanor's scientific training told her that such a massive oversight was unlikely to be accidental. Working with Margaret Chen's classified intelligence and Harold's meteorological data, Elena began to construct a three-dimensional model of Cooper's entire flight path. The simulation showed that Cooper had executed a controlled descent that demonstrated advanced parachuting skills. This wasn't a desperate leap into the unknown. It was a precisely calculated maneuver performed by someone with extensive training in high-altitude jumps. Elena's analysis of the physical evidence yielded even more disturbing conclusions. The money that had been found along the Columbia River showed signs of exposure patterns that were inconsistent with the official story. Chemical analysis revealed traces of compounds that suggested the bills had been buried deliberately, not scattered by natural forces. Someone had planted the evidence to support the narrative that Cooper had perished in the wilderness. The parachute fragments that had been recovered over the years told a similar story. Elena's examination of the fabric degradation patterns showed that the parachutes had been cut and weathered artificially to simulate decades of exposure. The evidence that had been used to support Cooper's death was as fabricated as the mythology surrounding his disappearance. As Elena's investigation progressed, she became aware of the personal risks she was taking. Her laboratory's computer systems had been infiltrated multiple times, and she had noticed unmarked vehicles parked outside her apartment. The same forces that had suppressed the truth about Cooper for 50 years were now focused on her, and Eleanor knew that her scientific curiosity had made her a target. The breakthrough came when Elena realized that Cooper's jump coordinates had been deliberately falsified in the official reports. The flight crew's statements about the exact location of the jump had been altered after the fact, shifting the apparent landing zone by dozens of miles. This level of deception could only have been orchestrated by someone with access to the highest levels of the investigation. Elena's computer models painted a picture of a precisely executed escape that bore no resemblance to the desperate gamble portrayed in popular culture. Cooper had jumped precisely when the conditions were ideal, fully aware of the atmospheric factors that would determine his landing site. He had landed safely in a predetermined location where extraction was possible. The scientific planning and successful execution of Cooper's escape completely transformed the case. The tale wasn't a story of a man who had vanished into the wilderness. It was the account of a professional operation that had been covered up by the very agencies tasked with solving it. Elena's calculations had revealed the truth that had been hidden for half a century. D.B. Cooper had survived his jump and disappeared into a new life, protected by the same government that claimed to be searching for him. Thomas Hartwell had spent 31 years in the basement archives of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, a ghost among the filing cabinets and storage boxes that contained the secrets of American law enforcement. His domain was a labyrinth of classified documents, cold case files, and evidence that would never see the light of day. When he received the encrypted package containing Harold Weatherby's meteorological analysis, Margaret Chen's classified intelligence, and Elena Vasquez's trajectory calculations, Thomas realized that his unique position made him the perfect person to uncover the complete truth about the Cooper case. The FBI archives contained more than just official reports and evidence logs. Hidden within the vast collection were personal memos, interdepartmental communications, and administrative records that painted a picture of the Cooper investigation that had never been revealed to the public. Thomas's systematic approach to document analysis had made him invaluable to the Bureau, but it also gave him access to information that could expose the most significant cover-up in FBI history. Thomas began his investigation by examining the personnel files of every agent who had worked on the Cooper case. What he discovered challenged everything he thought he knew about the Bureau's commitment to justice. The lead investigators had been transferred or retired immediately after the case was officially suspended, and their personal files contained discrepancies that suggested they had been silenced rather than reassigned. The evidence logs revealed an even more disturbing pattern. Critical pieces of physical evidence had been mysteriously lost or destroyed over the years, always during periods when new investigators were assigned to the case. The timing of these losses suggested that someone within the Bureau was actively working to prevent the case from being solved. Thomas's analysis showed that the Cooper investigation had been sabotaged from within. Administrative records from 1971 contained references to Operation Maple, a classified program that Thomas had never encountered in his decades of archival work. The program had been initiated 3 days before the Cooper hijacking and terminated 2 weeks after Cooper's jump. The timing was too convenient to be coincidental, and Thomas's attempts to access the complete Operation Maple files triggered security alerts that indicated the program was still classified at the highest levels. Thomas's investigation led him to a series of financial records that had been buried in the archives for 50 years. The records showed that significant amounts of money had been moved through covert accounts immediately after the Cooper hijacking, amounts that far exceeded the $200,000 Cooper had demanded from the airline. The financial trail suggested that the hijacking had been a cover for a much larger operation involving millions of dollars in untraceable funds. The personnel files revealed that Daniel B. Cooper had indeed been a CIA operative, but his official record had been sanitized to remove any reference to his specialized training in high-altitude operations and psychological warfare. The man who had walked onto Flight 305 was not a desperate criminal, but a highly trained professional with decades of experience in covert operations. Sarah Mitchell had built her career on asking uncomfortable questions. As an investigative journalist for the Washington Herald, she had exposed corruption in Congress, revealed defense contractor fraud, and uncovered scandals that had brought down cabinet officials. But nothing in her 20-year career had prepared her for the story that landed in her encrypted inbox on a cold February morning. The package contained Harold Weatherby's meteorological analysis, Margaret Chen's classified intelligence, Elena Vasquez's trajectory calculations, and Thomas Hartwell's archival discoveries, a comprehensive dossier that revealed the truth about the D.B. Cooper case. Sarah's initial reaction was skepticism. The Cooper case had been investigated by countless reporters, authors, and amateur sleuths over the decades, and the idea that a meteorologist, a government analyst, a physicist, and an archivist had uncovered evidence that had eluded the FBI for 50 years seemed improbable. But as she examined the documentation, Sarah realized that she was looking at the most significant story of her career. The evidence was overwhelming and mutually corroborating. Harold's wind pattern analysis proved that Cooper had landed in Oregon, not Washington. Margaret's classified files revealed that Cooper had been a CIA operative. Eleanor's trajectory calculations showed that the escape had been scientifically planned and executed. Thomas's archival research exposed the cover-up that had maintained the Cooper mythology for half a century. Sarah's investigation into the story's sources convinced her that the 4 individuals had acted independently, each following their own path to the same shocking conclusion. The convergence of their evidence created a narrative that was both compelling and terrifying. The Cooper case wasn't just unsolved. It was a carefully constructed lie that had been maintained by the highest levels of government. As Sarah began to verify the evidence, she encountered resistance that confirmed the story's significance. Government officials who had previously been accessible refused to return her calls. Sources within the intelligence community warned her that pursuing the story would end her career. The message was clear. The Cooper case was off limits, and Sarah's investigation had attracted attention from forces that operated outside normal channels. The deeper Sarah dug, the more she understood why the Cooper case had been kept secret for so long. The revelation that Cooper had been a government operative would expose a CIA program that had conducted illegal domestic operations during the Cold War. The cover-up had been necessary to prevent a scandal that could have brought down the intelligence community and exposed decades of constitutional violations. Stonewalling and outright hostility met Sarah's attempts to corroborate the story through official channels. The FBI refused to comment on the meteorological evidence, the CIA denied any knowledge of Daniel B. Cooper, and the Department of Justice claimed that all relevant files had been destroyed. The wall of silence that surrounded the Cooper case was itself evidence of the conspiracy that Sarah was trying to expose. The personal cost of pursuing the story began to mount as Sarah's investigation continued. Her apartment was burglarized, her computer was hacked, and she received anonymous warnings about the consequences of publishing the Cooper revelations. The same forces that had kept the secret for 50 years were now focused on preventing her from revealing the truth to the American people. Sarah's editor at the Washington Herald initially supported her investigation, but as the evidence mounted and the pressure increased, he began to express concerns about the story's potential impact on the newspaper's relationship with government sources. The Herald's publisher, a man who had built his career on maintaining cordial relationships with Washington's power brokers, made it clear that the Cooper story would not be published. Faced with institutional resistance and personal threats, Sarah made a decision that would define the rest of her career. She would publish the Cooper revelations independently, using her own resources and accepting the consequences of exposing one of the most significant cover-ups in American history. The same forces that had concealed the truth about D.B. Cooper for half a century could not afford to bury it. Sarah's investigation had revealed that the Cooper case was more than just a mystery. It was a window into the shadow government that operated beyond public scrutiny and constitutional oversight. The story began with the man who had jumped from Flight 305, unveiling the murky depths of American intelligence operations and the extreme measures the government took to safeguard its secrets. As Sarah prepared to publish her findings, she understood that she was about to become the most dangerous journalist in America. The Cooper revelations would reveal a conspiracy that penetrated the highest echelons of government, and Sarah Mitchell was ready to bear the consequences for revealing this truth. The truth about D.B. Cooper was more extraordinary than any fiction about him. Daniel Benjamin Cooper had been a CIA operative specializing in deep cover operations during the height of the Cold War. His mission on November 24, 1971, had been to intercept a Soviet agent who was planning to defect with intelligence about American defense systems. The hijacking had been a cover story, designed to explain Cooper's presence on Flight 305 and provide justification for his subsequent disappearance. Operation Maple had been a joint CIA-FBI program designed to conduct domestic surveillance operations against suspected communist sympathizers. Cooper's role had been to infiltrate Soviet intelligence networks and gather information about enemy operations on American soil. The program had been illegal under federal law, but it had been authorized at the highest levels of government and had operated in complete secrecy for over a decade. The Soviet agent Cooper, who was supposed to intercept, never made it to the rendezvous. Intelligence sources later revealed that the KGB had eliminated the defector before he could reach American soil. Cooper's mission had been compromised, but he had already begun the hijacking that was supposed to provide his cover story. With no defector to apprehend and no intelligence to gather, Cooper had been faced with a choice: abort the mission and risk exposure, or complete the operation and disappear into a new identity. Cooper had chosen to disappear, but his escape had been aided by the same government that officially claimed to be searching for him. The CIA had provided Cooper with the parachutes, the money, and the extraction plan that had allowed him to vanish without a trace. The subsequent search efforts had been theatre, designed to maintain the illusion that Cooper was a common criminal who had perished in the wilderness. The money that Cooper had demanded from Northwest Orient had been a fraction of the funds involved in Operation Maple. The $200,000 hijacking had been used to conceal the movement of millions of dollars in covert funding that had been allocated to illegal domestic surveillance operations. The Cooper case had provided the perfect cover for financial transactions that would have been impossible to justify through normal channels. Cooper's successful escape had created a problem for the intelligence community. A trained operative with knowledge of illegal domestic operations was now living under an assumed identity, potentially vulnerable to foreign recruitment or personal blackmail. They made the decision to uphold the Cooper mythology and prevent the public from learning the truth about his escape. Over the years, they carefully planted the physical evidence to support the narrative that Cooper had died during his jump. The money found along the Columbia River had been aged artificially and placed where it would be found by investigators. The parachute fragments had been cut and weathered to simulate decades of exposure. Every piece of evidence had been fabricated to support the official story. Cooper himself had been relocated to a secure facility where he had been debriefed and prepared for life under a new identity. The man who had jumped from Flight 305 had been given a new name, a new background, and a new life in exchange for his silence about Operation Maple and his knowledge of illegal CIA activities. He had been hidden in plain sight, protected by the same government that claimed to be searching for him. The revelation that Cooper had been a government operative explained why the case had remained unsolved for over 50 years. The FBI hadn't failed to catch Cooper, They had succeeded in protecting him. The investigation had been a carefully orchestrated performance designed to maintain public interest, while ensuring that the truth never emerged. The Cooper case had become a cultural phenomenon precisely because it had been designed to capture public imagination. The mysterious gentleman bandit who had outsmarted the system and disappeared into legend had been a creation of government propaganda, a story that had been carefully crafted to distract attention from the real crimes that had been committed under the cover of national security. The 4 individuals who had uncovered the truth about Cooper had been working independently, each following their path to the same shocking conclusion. Their evidence had converged to reveal a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of government and exposed the dark reality of American intelligence operations during the Cold War. The Cooper case had been more than just a cover-up. It had been a test of the government's ability to control public perception and maintain official narratives in the face of contradictory evidence. The success of the Cooper mythology had provided a template for future deceptions, proving that even the most improbable stories could be accepted as truth if they were presented with sufficient authority and maintained with unwavering consistency. The disclosure of D.B. Cooper's true identity shook the American intelligence community and fundamentally altered the framework of government accountability. Sarah Mitchell's independent publication of the Cooper files triggered a cascade of events that exposed not just the truth about one famous skyjacker, but an entire network of illegal operations that had been conducted under the cover of national security. Government officials launched a coordinated campaign to discredit the evidence and silence the whistleblowers who revealed the truth within hours of the story's publication. Harold Weatherby was arrested on charges of stealing classified meteorological data. Margaret Chen was suspended from her position at the Department of Justice. Elena Vasquez faced an investigation into her laboratory's security protocols, and Thomas Hartwell was terminated from his position at the FBI archives. The Cooper revelations exposed the government's extreme measures to safeguard its secrets. The 4 individuals who had uncovered the truth found themselves facing criminal charges, professional ruin, and personal threats. The same forces that had upheld the Cooper cover-up for half a century now targeted anyone who dared to reveal the wider conspiracy. Sarah Mitchell's publication of the Cooper files had been timed to coincide with the release of documents to multiple international news organizations, ensuring that the story could not be suppressed through normal channels. The evidence was simultaneously published in London, Berlin, and Tokyo, creating a global media sensation that forced American officials to respond to questions they had hoped would never be asked. The Cooper case garnered international attention, revealing the extent to which American intelligence operations transcended constitutional boundaries during the Cold War. The exposure of Operation Maple led to investigations into other domestic surveillance programs that had been conducted without congressional oversight or judicial authorization. The Cooper case unlocked decades of hidden government activities. Congressional hearings into the Cooper cover-up revealed that the conspiracy had been maintained by a small group of officials who had remained in positions of power for decades. These individuals had used their influence to ensure that the truth about Cooper never emerged, manipulating investigations, suppressing evidence, and eliminating anyone who came too close to the truth. The revelation that Cooper had been living under government protection for over 50 years raised questions about how many other mysteries had been deliberately maintained to conceal illegal activities. The Cooper case had been just one example of the government's willingness to deceive the public to protect its operational secrets and political interests. The search for Cooper himself became a global manhunt as intelligence agencies around the world attempted to locate the man who had become the most famous skyjacker in history. The revelation that Cooper had been a government operative made him a valuable target for foreign intelligence services, and his knowledge of Cold War operations made him a security risk that could not be ignored. Cooper was eventually located living under an assumed identity in a small town in Montana, where he had been working as a high school physics teacher for over 4 decades. His peaceful existence had been shattered by the revelation of his true identity, and he found himself at the center of a media circus that threatened to expose not just his past, but the lives of everyone he had come to know and love. In exchange for immunity from prosecution and protection for his family, the man once known as D.B. Cooper agreed to testify before Congress. His testimony unveiled the complete scope of Operation Maple and exposed the illicit activities carried out under the guise of national security. His words brought down a government based on lies and deception. The Cooper revelations triggered a constitutional crisis that forced America to confront the reality of its shadow government and the extent to which democratic institutions had been subverted by intelligence operations. The case that had begun as a simple hijacking had exposed a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of government and challenged the very foundations of American democracy. The four individuals who had uncovered the truth about Cooper became symbols of the power of independent investigation and the importance of government accountability. Their bravery in exposing the conspiracy cost them their jobs and safety, but it also revealed the truth about one of America's most enduring mysteries and forced the nation to confront the reality of its hidden history. The solution to the Cooper case revealed a truth more disturbing than any mystery. The man who jumped from Flight 305 was a government agent, and the agencies that claimed to be looking for him helped him escape. The greatest mystery in American criminal history had been solved, but the truth had shattered the illusions that had sustained the nation for over 50 years. D.B. Cooper was never the gentleman bandit portrayed in popular imagination. He had been a weapon of the state, a tool of oppression disguised as a folk hero. The revelation of his true identity had exposed the dark reality of American power and the lengths to which the government would go to protect its secrets. The Cooper case was finally closed, but the reckoning had just begun. Dr. Elena Vasquez had dissected corporate fraud cases for 23 years. Her analytical mind trained to spot deception in spreadsheets and financial statements. Yet nothing in her forensic accounting background prepared her for the peculiar invitation that arrived on a Tuesday morning in March. The envelope bore no return address, only her name written in an archaic script that seemed to dance across the cream-coloured paper. Inside, a single photograph showed a page filled with indecipherable text surrounding botanical illustrations that defied classification. The note, typed on what appeared to be a manual typewriter, read, "Professor Vasquez, your expertise in pattern recognition may unlock what has confounded scholars for centuries. The By-Necker Library, Yale University, Room 102, Thursday, 2 p.m. Come alone." Eleanor's rational mind screamed caution, but curiosity had always been her weakness. She had built her reputation on finding hidden connections in seemingly random data, and this mysterious manuscript represented the ultimate puzzle. After arranging leave from her position at the Federal Bureau of Investigation's Financial Crimes Unit, she found herself standing before the imposing Gothic Revival architecture of Yale's rare book library. Room 102 contained a single occupant, a tall woman with silver hair pulled into a severe bun, her fingers dancing across a tablet displaying high-resolution scans of manuscript pages. Dr. Miriam Thornfield introduced herself as a paleographer who had spent 15 years studying medieval texts. Her eyes held the particular exhaustion that comes from chasing answers that consistently retreat further into shadow. "The Voynich manuscript," Miriam began without preamble, "has been carbon dated to the early 15th century. 240 pages of vellum containing over 35,000 words in an unknown script, accompanied by illustrations of plants that don't exist, astronomical charts that correspond to no known celestial patterns, and human figures engaged in activities that border on the incomprehensible." Elena studied the images on the tablet. The text flowed with organic curves and elaborate flourishes, suggesting a living language rather than an elaborate cipher. Yet patterns emerged from the chaos, repeated character combinations, consistent spacing, a rhythm that implied grammatical structure. Her forensic training kicked in automatically, cataloguing potential entry points for analysis. "Why me?" Eleanor asked. "Surely cryptographers and linguists have examined this extensively." Miriam's smile carried bitter undertones. "They have. The manuscript has been studied by everyone from medieval scholars to computer scientists at the NSA. William Friedman, who broke Japanese diplomatic codes during World War II, spent decades on this text without success. Modern statistical analysis suggests it contains too much entropy to be gibberish, yet too little to be a natural language. It exists in a linguistic twilight zone that shouldn't be possible. The older woman gestured toward the manuscript images. But 3 months ago, I discovered something that changes everything. Hidden within the apparently random distribution of characters, there's a secondary pattern, a mathematical sequence that only becomes visible when you analyze the text using forensic accounting techniques designed to detect sophisticated financial fraud. Eleanor felt her pulse quicken. What kind of pattern? The same type of hidden structure used by money launderers to disguise transactions across multiple accounts. Someone, or something, embedded information within this manuscript, using techniques that wouldn't be invented for another 500 years. The question isn't just what the Voynich manuscript says, Elena. The question is who knew enough about information theory in 1404 to create it. Thunder rumbled outside the library windows, and Elena found herself wondering if she was about to step through a door that would fundamentally alter her understanding of history itself. The manuscript pages glowed softly in the afternoon light, their secrets intact after 6 centuries of scrutiny. But now, armed with modern analytical tools and an unconventional perspective, she sensed that those secrets might finally be ready to yield. The game, as someone much more famous than she might have said, was afoot. Elena spent the next 3 weeks in a cramped office adjacent to the Beinecker's conservation lab, surrounded by printouts, statistical analyses, and increasingly complex diagrams that mapped the manuscript's linguistic structure. Her forensic accounting software, originally designed to trace financial crimes across international banking networks, had been reprogrammed to analyze medieval text, with surprising effectiveness. The patterns Miriam had discovered were indeed present, but they formed only the outermost layer of a far more sophisticated system. Elena's background in detecting layered financial deception proved invaluable as she peeled back successive levels of encoding. The Voynich text wasn't simply encrypted, it was architected, constructed according to principles that seemed to anticipate modern information theory by half a millennium. "Look at this," Elena said, pointing to a cluster analysis displayed on her laptop screen. Dr. Thornfield peered over her shoulder, bringing the scent of jasmine perfume and old books. The character frequency distribution follows Zipf's law almost perfectly, which is what you'd expect from natural language. But when I analyse the text using Benford's law, the same principle I use to detect accounting fraud, something extraordinary emerges. The graph on screen showed a series of peaks and valleys that formed an unmistakable pattern. Elena had seen similar structures in her FBI work, always indicating that someone had deliberately manipulated data to hide information within apparently random noise. The manuscript authors understood statistical analysis, Elena continued. They knew that future readers would apply mathematical tools to decode their work, so they embedded multiple layers of misdirection. It's like finding a computer virus written in Latin and hidden inside a medieval cookbook. Miriam frowned at the screen. But that's impossible. The mathematical concepts you're describing weren't formalized until the 19th and 20th centuries. Medieval scholars might have possessed intuitive understanding of patterns, but this level of sophistication suggests knowledge of probability theory, information entropy, and statistical distribution that simply didn't exist in 1404. Unless, Eleanor said slowly, the manuscript wasn't written in 1404. They stared at each other across the cluttered desk. The carbon dating results were unambiguous. The vellum pages had indeed been created in the early 15th century. But carbon dating only confirmed when the writing surface was prepared, not when the text was added. Elena pulled up another analysis. I've been studying the ink composition based on spectroscopic data from the Yale conservation team. The pigments are consistent with medieval materials, but there's something odd about their distribution. The manuscript wasn't written continuously over time, as you'd expect from a scholarly work. Instead, it appears to have been completed in a single intensive effort, possibly over just a few weeks or months. "A crash project," Miriam murmured. Someone working under extreme time pressure. Or someone who knew exactly what they wanted to say before they started writing. The text shows no corrections, no revisions, no evolution of ideas. It reads like a fair copy of work that was composed elsewhere, in another form. Eleanor's computer chimed, indicating that her latest analysis had finished processing. The results made both women freeze. Hidden within the manuscript's botanical section, her software had detected something that shouldn't exist. A sophisticated error correction code, the same type used in modern digital communications to ensure accurate data transmission across unreliable networks. "Elena," Miriam whispered, "I think we're looking at a message. Not a book or a scientific treatise, but a communication from someone who possessed advanced knowledge of linguistics, mathematics, and information theory. Someone who expected that future readers would develop the tools necessary to decode their work." The implications were staggering. The Voynich manuscript wasn't just an unsolved puzzle, it was a time capsule, a deliberate attempt to communicate across centuries using principles that wouldn't be discovered until the modern era. But who could have possessed such knowledge in the medieval period? And what message was so important that it required such elaborate protection? Outside the library windows, New Haven settled into evening shadow. Elena stared at the manuscript pages, feeling as though she was engaging in a conversation across 600 years of history. Someone had anticipated this moment, had known that future scholars would develop the mathematical tools necessary to pierce their veil of secrecy. The question was no longer what the Voynich manuscript contained. The question was who had written it, and why they had gone to such extraordinary lengths to ensure their message would survive the centuries intact. The breakthrough came at 2:47 a.m. on a Thursday, when Elena's pattern recognition software identified something that made her spill coffee across her keyboard. Hidden within the manuscript's botanical illustrations was a classification system that preceded Carl Linnaeus by 3 centuries, and included plants that wouldn't be discovered by European botanists until the age of global exploration. Dr. Sarah Chen, the botanist Eleanor had quietly consulted, arrived at the library the following morning carrying a thick folder of printouts and wearing an expression of barely controlled excitement. Sarah specialized in ethnobotany and had spent years studying how different cultures classified and utilized plant species. Her preliminary analysis of the Voynich botanical illustrations had kept her awake for 3 nights straight. "Elena, these aren't just imaginary plants," Sarah said, spreading detailed comparison charts across the table. "Look at this illustration on folio 99R. The manuscript shows a flowering plant with distinctive 7-lobed leaves and compound umbel inflorescences. I've identified it as Panax quinquefolius, American ginseng." Elena studied the medieval illustration, then the modern botanical photograph Sarah placed beside it. The resemblance was unmistakable, down to the characteristic root structure and berry formation. But American ginseng wasn't known to European scholars until the 18th century, Elena said. Columbus hadn't even reached the Americas when this manuscript was created. Exactly, and it gets stranger. This illustration here matches Cinchona officinalis, the South American tree that produces quinine. The manuscript shows not just the plant's appearance, but also what appears to be an extraction process for its medicinal compounds. European doctors didn't learn about quinine until Spanish colonists brought samples back from Peru in the 1630s. Sarah pulled out more comparisons. "I've identified at least 37 plants in this manuscript that shouldn't have been known to medieval European scholars. Some weren't catalogued by Western science until the 19th century. A few appear to be extinct species that we know only from fossil records." The implications sent a chill through Elena's analytical mind. Either the manuscript was a remarkable work of imagination that accidentally predicted botanical discoveries centuries in advance, or its authors had access to plant specimens from around the globe, including some that no longer existed. "There's something else," Sarah continued, lowering her voice despite the empty library. "The manuscript doesn't just show these plants, it provides preparation instructions. These aren't decorative illustrations, they're technical diagrams showing how to process and combine various species for specific purposes. Some of the procedures match traditional medicine practices from cultures that had no contact with medieval Europe." Eleanor pulled up her linguistic analysis on the laptop. "That correlates with what I'm finding in the text. The sections accompanying botanical illustrations contain repeated terminology that appears to describe chemical processes. Not alchemy or medieval medicine, but something closer to modern pharmaceutical preparation." Miriam, who had been listening silently, spoke up. I've been researching the manuscript's provenance. The earliest confirmed owner was Emperor Rudolf II of Bohemia, who purchased it in 1586 for 600 gold ducats, an enormous sum, equivalent to millions in today's currency. Rudolf was obsessed with the occult and employed scholars from across Europe to study mysterious texts. But, according to his court records, even his experts couldn't decipher the manuscript. "Who did he buy it from?" Eleanor asked. That's where the investigation ends. The seller, a learned physician from the East, asserted that the book held ancient medical knowledge. The seller provided no name or further description. After Rudolf's death, the manuscript passed through several hands before ending up in the collection of Athanasius Kircher, a Jesuit scholar known for studying ancient languages. Sarah was examining another botanical illustration through a magnifying glass. "Elena, look at this plant on folio 78V. The root system is incredibly detailed. It shows mycorrhizal associations, the symbiotic relationships between plant roots and soil fungi. That level of understanding of plant biology wasn't achieved until the late 19th century. Eleanor sensed the fragments of an insurmountable puzzle beginning to shift in her mind. The manuscript wasn't just demonstrating advanced knowledge of linguistics and mathematics. It was revealing an understanding of botany, chemistry and biology that exceeded medieval capabilities by centuries. Whoever created this text possessed scientific knowledge that wouldn't be available to European scholars for hundreds of years. But perhaps most disturbing was the growing certainty that the botanical knowledge displayed in the manuscript wasn't theoretical. The detailed preparation methods and precise anatomical illustrations suggested hands-on experience with these plants. Someone had actually cultivated, harvested, and processed species from around the world, including some that were supposedly extinct. The Voynich manuscript was beginning to look less like a medieval curiosity and more like a technical manual created by someone with impossible access to global botanical resources and advanced scientific understanding. The question was no longer who had written it, but when and from where. Eleanor's discovery on the 15th day of her investigation fundamentally altered her understanding of what they were dealing with. While she was running the manuscript's astronomical charts through computational analysis software that is typically used to detect securities fraud, Elena uncovered mathematical relationships that should not have been possible in the medieval period. Dr. James Morrison, the MIT mathematician she had discreetly contacted, arrived at the Beinecker Library carrying a messenger bag full of printouts and wearing the distracted expression of someone who had been calculating in his head during the entire train ride from Boston. James specialized in the history of mathematical notation and had spent his career tracking how numerical concepts evolved across different cultures and times. The astronomical section contains calendrical calculations that use mathematical techniques not developed until the Renaissance, James said, spreading his analysis across the table. But more significant is what I found in the text structure itself. The author embedded mathematical proofs within the linguistic patterns, geometric theorems disguised as grammatical constructions. Eleanor studied James's diagrams, which mapped relationships between character frequencies and spatial distributions throughout the manuscript. What kind of theorems? Primarily number theory, but with applications to what we now call chaos mathematics and fractal geometry. The text structure reveals an understanding of recursive algorithms and self-similar patterns, concepts not formally described until the 20th century. Whoever wrote these words understood mathematical concepts that wouldn't be rediscovered for 500 years. Miriam looked up from the manuscript page she had been examining. Could this be a coincidence? Perhaps medieval scholars intuited mathematical relationships without formal proof systems? James shook his head. The precision is too exact. Look at this passage in the astronomical section. When I map the character distribution to numerical values, it produces a perfect approximation of pi that is accurate to 15 decimal places. The probability of achieving that accuracy by accident is essentially zero. Eleanor felt the familiar sensation that preceded major breakthroughs in her fraud investigations, the moment when apparently unrelated evidence suddenly cohered into a recognizable pattern. James, can you analyze the overall structure of the manuscript? Not individual sections, but the document as a whole. I've been working on that. James pulled out a large sheet covered with geometric diagrams. The manuscript's organization follows a mathematical sequence that controls everything from page length to illustration placement. It's based on principles of information compression, techniques for encoding maximum data in minimum space. The diagram showed the manuscript as a complex geometric structure, with text blocks and illustrations positioned according to mathematical relationships that optimized information density while maintaining visual coherence. Elena recognized similar patterns from her work analyzing sophisticated money laundering schemes, where criminals used mathematical principles to hide illicit transactions within legitimate financial flows. The author wasn't just recording knowledge, Elena said slowly. They were designing a storage and retrieval system. The manuscript is structured like a medieval database, with built-in indexing and cross-referencing that allows specific information to be located and extracted. Sarah, who had been quietly studying botanical illustrations, looked up with excitement. That explains why the plant drawings are so precisely positioned relative to the text. They're not decorative, they're part of the indexing system. The botanical knowledge is organized according to mathematical principles that allow rapid access to specific preparation methods or medicinal applications. James nodded. The astronomical charts serve a similar function. They're not just calendars or star maps. They're computational aids designed to help readers navigate the information contained in other sections. The mathematical relationships embedded in the charts provide keys for unlocking different layers of meaning throughout the manuscript. Elena pulled up her fraud detection software and began entering the structural parameters James had identified. If the manuscript is designed as an information storage system, there should be redundancy built in, multiple pathways to access the same data, backup encoding in case primary systems are compromised. The software ran for several minutes before producing results that made all four researchers fall silent. The manuscript contained not one, but 3 complete information systems, each using different encoding principles but containing overlapping data sets. It was designed to survive partial damage or incomplete transmission while maintaining access to core information. "This isn't a medieval text," Miriam said quietly. "It's an information preservation system created by someone who understood that knowledge could be lost, corrupted, or deliberately suppressed. They built multiple safeguards to ensure their data would survive across centuries." Elena stared at the manuscript pages with growing awe and unease. The Voynich manuscript wasn't just demonstrating impossible knowledge, it was revealing systematic preparation for knowledge preservation across vast spans of time. Someone in the medieval period had anticipated the need to transmit complex scientific information to future generations, using principles that wouldn't be formally understood for hundreds of years. The question was no longer who had created this remarkable document. The question was what knowledge was so important that it required such extraordinary protection, and why its authors had been so certain that normal channels of information transmission would fail. The revelation that changed everything came from an unexpected source. Dr. Lisa Park, a molecular biologist at Yale's medical school, had been quietly analysing microscopic samples from the manuscript's ink and vellum for trace genetic material. What she found challenged fundamental assumptions about the document's origins and raised questions that extended far beyond medieval scholarship. "I've extracted DNA fragments from organic components in the ink," Lisa explained, displaying molecular structures on her laptop screen. "The genetic material comes from plant sources used to create pigments, but the species profile is extraordinary. I've identified genetic markers from plants native to 6 different continents, including some that appear to be from species that went extinct thousands of years ago." Eleanor studied the genetic analysis, her fraud investigator instincts immediately recognizing the impossibility of the evidence. How could medieval ink contain genetic material from extinct species and plants from continents that hadn't been discovered yet? "That's not the strangest part," Lisa continued. "I've also found human genetic material, skin cells, hair follicles, and what appears to be saliva traces from multiple individuals who handled the manuscript during its creation. The genetic profiles don't match any known medieval European populations." Sarah leaned forward intently. "What do you mean?" "The genetic markers suggest ancestry from populations that shouldn't have been in Europe during the medieval period. Some of the DNA shows characteristics consistent with indigenous American populations. Others appear to be from East Asian lineages that weren't documented in European historical records until much later periods. James looked up from the mathematical analysis he had been reviewing. Could the genetic material have been contaminated over time, perhaps from later handlers of the manuscript? Lisa shook her head. I considered that possibility, but the genetic material is embedded within the ink itself, integrated at the molecular level during the manuscript's creation. This DNA was present when the text was originally written, not added later through contamination. The implications were staggering. The manuscript hadn't just been created by someone with impossible knowledge of future scientific developments, it had been created by individuals whose genetic ancestry suggested origins from multiple continents during a period when such contact was supposedly impossible. Eleanor pulled up her fraud detection software and began cross-referencing the genetic data with her linguistic and mathematical analyses. Lisa, can you determine how many different individuals contributed genetic material to the manuscript? At least 12 distinct genetic profiles, possibly more. The diversity suggests a collaborative effort involving people from dramatically different ancestral backgrounds. Some of the genetic markers are so unusual that I've submitted samples to the International Genome Consortium for comparison with ancient DNA databases. Miriam had been unusually quiet during Lisa's presentation. Now she spoke carefully as though testing dangerous ideas. What if the manuscript wasn't created in medieval Europe? What if it was brought there from somewhere else? Somewhere that diverse populations had access to global plant resources and advanced scientific knowledge. But the vellum is definitely medieval European, Sarah pointed out. The carbon dating is unambiguous. Carbon dating tells us when the animal that provided the skin died, Elena said slowly. It doesn't tell us when or where the skin was prepared for writing, or when the text was added. Someone could have acquired medieval vellum and used it as a writing surface much later. James was studying his mathematical analyses with new interest. Actually, that might explain some of the inconsistencies I've found in the computational methods. The mathematical techniques embedded in the text appear to come from different developmental periods. Some concepts that were advanced for the medieval era, others that seem more consistent with later mathematical understanding. Lisa pulled up another genetic analysis. There's something else. I found traces of what appears to be deliberately introduced genetic material, DNA that was added to the ink intentionally, not just through casual contact during writing. Someone embedded genetic information as part of the manuscript's content. Like a signature, Eleanor asked. More like a message. The genetic sequences contain artificial arrangements that don't occur naturally. Someone was using DNA as another layer of information storage, embedding genetic codes alongside the linguistic and mathematical encoding systems. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. The Voynich manuscript wasn't just a mysterious medieval text. It was a multi-layered information system that used genetic, mathematical, and linguistic encoding to preserve knowledge across time. Its creators had employed every available method of information storage, suggesting that the knowledge they were preserving was extraordinarily valuable and desperately needed protection. Eleanor felt the familiar thrill that came with solving complex fraud cases, combined with an entirely new sense of awe. We're not just looking at a medieval manuscript. We're looking at a technological artifact created by people who understood information theory, genetics, advanced mathematics, and global botany centuries before these fields were supposed to exist. But the most troubling question remained. Who were these people, and what knowledge was so important that it required protection using techniques that wouldn't be understood for hundreds of years? The manuscript was beginning to look less like a historical curiosity, and more like a message from a lost civilization that possessed scientific capabilities far exceeding anything documented in medieval European records. Eleanor's most significant breakthrough came during her 4th week at the Beinecker, when she discovered that the manuscript contained references to historical events that hadn't occurred when it was supposedly written. Hidden within the astronomical calculations were calendrical notations that corresponded to specific dates that fell centuries after the manuscript's purported creation. Dr. Richard Hawthorne, the Yale historian she had consulted, Arrived carrying copies of medieval chronicles and astronomical records, his usual academic composure replaced by barely contained excitement. Richard specialised in medieval chronography and had spent decades studying how different cultures recorded and calculated time. The astronomical section contains date calculations that reference the Gregorian calendar reform of 1582, Richard explained, pointing to specific passages in the manuscript. But more troubling are annotations that appear to predict historical events with impossible accuracy. This calculation here corresponds to the date of the 1755 Lisbon earthquake. This one matches the eruption of Mount Tambora in 1815. Elena studied the astronomical charts on her laptop screen, where she had overlaid Richard's historical correlations with her mathematical analysis. Could these be coincidences? Perhaps the authors were making general predictions about astronomical events. Not astronomical events, terrestrial ones. The manuscript contains calendrical references to specific historical occurrences that no medieval scholar could have predicted. Earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, even what appears to be references to political events that wouldn't occur for centuries. James looked up from the computational analysis he had been refining. I found similar temporal anomalies in the mathematical structure, the number sequences embedded in the text reference mathematical constants that weren't calculated until the 18th and 19th centuries. But more significantly, some of the calculations appear to be reverse engineered. They start with known results and work backward to derive principles. The implications made Elena's analytical mind reel. Reverse engineered from what known results? Scientific discoveries and mathematical proofs that weren't made until centuries after the manuscript was supposedly written. It's as though the authors had access to completed scientific knowledge and were encoding the principles that would eventually lead to those discoveries. Sarah had been quietly studying botanical illustrations while listening to the historians. Now she looked up with a disturbed expression. I've been analysing the plant preparation sequences in conjunction with modern pharmacological knowledge. The manuscript's medicinal formulations aren't just advanced for their time. They demonstrate understanding of drug interactions and biochemical processes that weren't discovered until the 20th century. She pointed to a particular illustration. This compound preparation protocol would produce a substance chemically identical to aspirin, but using plant sources that wouldn't be analysed for their salicylic acid content until the 1830s. The manuscript authors understood the molecular basis of the drug's effectiveness, without having access to the chemical knowledge that would explain why it worked. Lisa, who had been reviewing her genetic analysis, added another disturbing element to the puzzle. The human DNA I extracted from the manuscript shows something unprecedented. Some of the genetic markers suggest ancestry from populations that wouldn't exist for centuries after the manuscript was created. What do you mean? Eleanor asked. Genetic lineages that result from population mixing that occurred during later historical periods. Some of the DNA shows characteristics consistent with colonial-era genetic mixing between European, African, and indigenous American populations. However, the original ink contains this genetic material, not an addition from later contamination. The room fell silent as the researchers contemplated the impossible evidence accumulating before them. The manuscript wasn't just demonstrating advanced knowledge, it was revealing information that could only have been obtained from future times. Eleanor pulled up her fraud detection software and began entering the temporal anomalies as data points. Her analytical training had taught her to look for patterns in apparently impossible evidence and find logical explanations for seemingly contradictory information. What if, Eleanor said slowly, the manuscript wasn't created in the past at all? Could it have originated in a future era and subsequently found its way into the historical record? Miriam frowned. But the carbon dating is definitive. The vellum is unquestionably medieval. Carbon dating tells us when the writing surface was created, not when it was used. Someone with access to genuine medieval vellum could have created this manuscript at any point in history, then arranged for it to be discovered in historical collections. James was studying his mathematical analyses with new insight. That would explain the reverse engineering patterns I found. The authors had access to completed scientific knowledge, and were encoding it using techniques that would allow future researchers to rediscover the principles systematically. Eleanor sensed the remarkable puzzle gradually coming together. The Voynich manuscript isn't a medieval text that accidentally predicted future discoveries. It's a deliberately planted document created by people with advanced scientific knowledge who wanted to ensure that specific information would be preserved and rediscovered at the appropriate historical moment. But this explanation raised even more disturbing questions. Who possessed such advanced knowledge? Could you please let us know when the manuscript was actually created? And why had its authors gone to such elaborate lengths to disguise their message as a medieval curiosity? The manuscript pages glowed softly in the library's afternoon light, their secrets protected by layers of deception that had confounded scholars for centuries. But Eleanor sensed that they were finally approaching the truth, a truth that might fundamentally alter understanding of history, science, and the nature of human knowledge itself. On the 28th day of her investigation, Eleanor finally cracked the Voynich code. The breakthrough came not through linguistic analysis or mathematical computation, but through a flash of insight that transformed her understanding of what the manuscript actually was. It wasn't a book, a scientific treatise, or even a message in the conventional sense. It was an instruction manual for rebuilding civilization. The realization struck her at 3:17 a.m., while she was cross-referencing botanical preparations with mathematical sequences and genetic markers. The manuscript wasn't organized chronologically or thematically. It was structured as a systematic rebuilding guide, providing essential knowledge in the order it would be needed by a society recovering from catastrophic collapse. Elena called an emergency meeting of her research team for the following morning. When they assembled in the library's conference room, she had prepared a presentation that would challenge everything they thought they knew about human history. The Voynich manuscript is a post-apocalyptic survival guide, Eleanor began, displaying her comprehensive analysis on the conference room screen. It's written by survivors of an advanced civilization who were preparing future generations to rebuild scientific knowledge after a catastrophic collapse. She clicked to her first slide, showing the manuscript's organizational structure. The botanical section isn't just showing useful plants, it's providing instructions for establishing agriculture, creating medicines, and developing chemical processes using only naturally occurring resources. The astronomical charts aren't just calendars, they're navigation aids and agricultural timing guides for people who would need to rebuild basic farming and seasonal awareness. James leaned forward intently. That would explain the mathematical reverse engineering I found. The authors were encoding advanced scientific principles in forms that could be rediscovered systematically, providing a pathway from basic observations to sophisticated scientific understanding. Sarah nodded excitedly. And the plant preparations make perfect sense from that perspective. They're not just showing medicinal recipes. They're providing the chemical knowledge necessary to develop pharmaceuticals using primitive technology. Someone who lost access to modern manufacturing could use these instructions to create essential medicines from scratch. Lisa pulled up her genetic analysis. The DNA evidence supports this theory. The multiple genetic lineages suggest a diverse group of survivors, possibly from different geographical origins, who came together during a crisis period. The deliberately embedded genetic sequences could be preserving important biological information, perhaps even genetic templates for rebuilding biodiversity. Elena clicked to her next slide, showing temporal correlations. The historical predictions embedded in the astronomical calculations aren't prophecies, they're warnings. The manuscript authors experienced a civilizational collapse and were trying to prepare future societies for similar catastrophic events. They encoded information about recurring geological and astronomical phenomena that pose existential threats. Miriam had been quietly studying the manuscript pages during Elena's presentation. Now she looked up with a mixture of awe and concern. If this interpretation is correct, when was the manuscript actually created? And what catastrophe were its authors trying to help us survive? Elena displayed her final analysis, a timeline that integrated all their discoveries into a coherent narrative. Based on the scientific knowledge demonstrated, the genetic diversity of the authors, and the specific technologies they were trying to preserve, I believe the manuscript was created sometime between the late 20th and early 21st centuries. The authors were survivors of an advanced technological civilization that experienced catastrophic collapse. But that's impossible, Richard protested. The manuscript has been documented in historical collections for centuries. Emperor Rudolph II acquired it in 1586. What if the manuscript was created by people who had mastered time travel or temporal communication? Elena asked. What if the authors were future survivors who found a way to send information backward through time, placing essential knowledge into the historical record at a point where it would be preserved and rediscovered when needed? The room fell silent as the implications sank in. Eleanor continued. The elaborate encoding wasn't just to hide the information, it was to ensure that it would only be decipherable by a civilization that had developed sufficient scientific sophistication to benefit from the knowledge. We're not just reading a medieval manuscript, we're receiving a message from our future, from survivors of a civilization that may be us. James was studying the mathematical analysis with new understanding. The information preservation systems make perfect sense from that perspective. The authors were creating a time capsule designed to survive across centuries or millennia, waiting for a civilization to develop the tools necessary to decode it. Elena looked around the table at her colleagues, seeing her mixture of excitement and terror reflected in their faces. The Voynich manuscript isn't just an unsolved mystery, it's a warning and a gift from survivors of human civilization's collapse, providing us with the knowledge we'll need to rebuild after our own catastrophic failure. She paused, allowing the weight of that revelation to sink in. The question is no longer what the manuscript says. The question is whether we're wise enough to learn from it before we experience the collapse that its authors survived. Outside the library windows, the modern world continued its daily routines, unaware that hidden in Yale's rare book collection was a message from the future, a desperate attempt by the survivors of humanity's greatest failure to ensure that civilization could rise again from its ashes. The Voynich manuscript had finally revealed its secret. It was humanity's last hope, encoded in an impossible text and sent backward through time by people who had lived through the end of the world and were determined to give their ancestors the tools to build it anew. Elena stared at the medieval pages, realizing that she was looking at the most important document in human history, a manual for surviving the unthinkable, written by people who had already lived through it and were reaching across time itself to offer their knowledge to a species that would need it to survive. The message was clear. Learn, prepare, and remember. The future depends on it. St. Mars had grown accustomed to the weight of secrets, but this particular prisoner pressed against his conscience like a stone in his boot. For 34 years, he had shepherded this masked figure through 4 different fortresses, watching the man's shoulders gradually bow under the accumulated burden of anonymity. The iron mask itself, contrary to popular imagination, was actually black velvet, lined with whalebone and secured with a silver clasp that caught the morning light streaming through the Bastille's narrow windows. The prisoner's morning routine never varied. He would rise at dawn, perform his ablutions with the meticulous care of a man who understood that dignity lay in the details when everything else had been stripped away. His hands, St. Mars had noticed, bore the soft calluses of someone who had once handled documents extensively, yet they moved with the practiced precision of a swordsman. This contradiction had puzzled the governor for decades. What haunted St. Mars most was the prisoner's voice. When he spoke, which was rare and only to him, it carried the unmistakable cadence of court education, each syllable weighted with the authority of someone born to command. Yet there was something else, a subtle accent that suggested foreign tutoring, perhaps Italian or Spanish influence. The prisoner's French was perfect, but it was the perfection of study rather than nativity. The morning of September 19th, 1703 began differently. The prisoner had requested paper and ink, breaking a silence that had lasted nearly 3 years. St. Mars hesitated, remembering the explicit instructions from Versailles. No writing materials, no visitors, no opportunity for communication beyond the essential. But the man's recent illness had left him gaunt, and St. Mars found himself moved by an unexpected compassion. "You know I cannot permit this," he said, his voice softer than protocol demanded. The prisoner turned toward the window, his masked profile creating a stark silhouette against the grey morning. "I do not seek to send messages, Monsieur de Saint-Mars. I merely wish to order my thoughts. A dying man's privilege, perhaps." The words carried a finality that chilled the governor. He had seen many prisoners face death, but this man's acceptance held a resignation that spoke of deeper wounds than physical illness. Saint-Mars found himself wondering, not for the first time, what crime could warrant such elaborate punishment? What sin demanded not just imprisonment, but the complete erasure of identity? Later that evening, Saint-Mars made his customary rounds. The prisoner had died quietly, sometime between Vespers and Compline, seated in his chair facing the window. His masked face remained turned toward the courtyard, where other prisoners took their daily exercise, as if he had been watching lives he could never join. The governor's fingers trembled as he reached for the silver clasp, but he stopped himself. Even in death, the mystery would remain inviolate. The funeral arrangements were as peculiar as the man's life had been. The body was buried quickly in the cemetery of St. Paul, under the name Marchioli, a name that meant nothing to anyone, including Saint-Mars. The gravestone bore no dates, no epitaph, just the single word etched in plain letters. The mask was burned, its ashes scattered to the wind from the Bastille's highest tower. Yet questions lingered like smoke in the governor's mind. Why had Louis XIV personally overseen every detail of this prisoner's custody? Why had the Sun King's instructions been so specific about the mask, about the prohibition on viewing the man's face? Saint-Mars had served the crown faithfully for 40 years, but this secret felt different, heavier somehow, as if it contained the power to shake the very foundations of the realm. As he prepared his final report to Versailles, Saint-Mars found himself hesitating over the usual formalities. The prisoner was dead, but the mystery lived on, passed now to whoever would read these carefully worded dispatches. He wondered if future generations would ever unravel the truth, or if the masked man's identity would remain forever lost in the labyrinthine corridors of royal discretion. The candle flickered as he sealed the letter, casting dancing shadows across the walls of his study. Outside, Paris slept, unaware that one of its greatest enigmas had quietly slipped into history. 23 years earlier, in a sun-drenched villa outside Madrid, a young man named Eustache Dorga received a letter that would alter the course of European history. The parchment bore the seal of Nicolas Fouquet, the former superintendent of finances, whose spectacular downfall had shaken the French court to its foundations. Dorga, serving as valet to the Duke of Mantua, had been carefully cultivating relationships with Spanish nobility, his true allegiance hidden beneath layers of practiced deception. The letter was brief, written in a cipher that Dorga recognized immediately. Fouquet, imprisoned in the fortress of Pignerol, was requesting a service that would require all of Dorga's accumulated skills in espionage and subterfuge. The disgraced minister had discovered something during his imprisonment, a document that revealed the true parentage of a child born to Queen Maria Theresa of Spain, Louis XIV's wife, in 1661. The implications were staggering. If this child was not Louis XIV's offspring, but rather the result of a liaison between the Queen and her Spanish confessor, the entire succession of the French throne could be thrown into question. More dangerously, if the child still lived and could be proven legitimate, it would provide Spain with a potential claimant to the French crown, a living weapon in the ongoing struggle between the two powers. Dorga's investigation led him through the shadowy networks of Spanish intelligence, where he encountered a Jesuit priest named Father Pregnani. The priest, uneasy and evidently unfamiliar with international intrigue, held documents that validated Fouquet's assertions. But there was more. Much more. The child had not died in infancy, as court records suggested, but had been spirited away to a monastery in the Pyrenees, where he had been raised in ignorance of his true heritage. The young man, now approaching his 20th birthday, bore an uncanny resemblance to Louis XIV, so striking that it could not be mere coincidence. His facial features were almost identical to the Sun King's, down to the distinctive Habsburg chin inherited from his Spanish mother. This resemblance was precisely what made him so dangerous and so valuable. Dorga's handler in Madrid, a spy master known only as El Conde, saw immediately the potential for chaos. If this young man could be placed at the French court, even briefly, the resemblance alone would fuel rumours and conspiracy theories that could destabilise Louis XIV's reign. The Spanish crown, still smarting from territorial losses in the recent war, was eager to employ any weapon that might weaken their French rivals. But Deuga had his own agenda. Years of serving multiple masters had taught him that few in his profession could afford loyalty. He began to consider a different approach, one that would serve his interests while potentially benefiting France. If he could capture this dangerous pretender and deliver him to Louis XIV, the reward would be substantial. More importantly, it would secure his position within the French intelligence apparatus. The plan Deuga devised was elegant in its simplicity. He would approach the young man, claiming to be an agent of the Spanish crown with orders to bring him to Madrid to claim his rightful inheritance. The naive monastery-raised youth would likely trust him, having no experience with the treacherous world of international politics. Once in Deuga's custody, the journey would mysteriously redirect toward the French border. However, as Deuga prepared to implement his scheme, he discovered that others were also moving pieces on this particular chessboard. A group of Spanish nobles, led by the Duke of Medina Sidonia, had learned of the young man's existence and were planning their approach. Their goal was more ambitious. They intended to use the pretender as a rallying point for Spanish territorial claims in southern France. The situation became even more complex when Deuga learned that French agents were already aware of the threat. Minister Louvois had dispatched his operatives to Spain with orders to eliminate the problem permanently. Multiple factions were now converging on his remote mountain sanctuary, threatening the young man's life. As autumn approached, Deuga found himself racing against time and numerous adversaries. The stakes had escalated far beyond his original expectations, and he began to realize that his survival might depend on making the right choice in the coming confrontation. The Spanish gambit was about to reach its climax, and the consequences would echo through the courts of Europe for generations to come. The fortress of Pignerol, carved into the Alpine foothills like a crown of stone, had witnessed many secrets during its tumultuous history. But in the winter of 1681, it harboured a mystery that would challenge the very foundations of royal authority. Nicolas Fouquet, the former superintendent who had dared to outshine the Sun King himself, sat in his cell composing what he believed would be his final testament, a document that would either secure his freedom or guarantee his death. Fouquet's fingers, cramped from years of careful penmanship, traced the outline of a hidden compartment he had carved into his cell wall. Within lay the fruit of months of clandestine correspondence with contacts throughout Europe, gathered through a network of servants, guards, and fellow prisoners who had no idea of the explosive nature of the information they carried. The key revelation centered on a series of diplomatic pouches that had been intercepted during Fouquet's tenure as superintendent. Among the routine dispatches between Madrid and Paris lay coded messages discussing the Spanish prince, a designation that had puzzled Fouquet until he began to piece together the implications. The Queen of France, Maria Theresa, had indeed given birth to a child in 1661, but the paternity was far more complex than court records suggested. By meticulously scrutinizing dates, movements, and financial records, Fouquet meticulously pieced together a story that would shock Louis XIV. The Queen, lonely and isolated in a foreign court, had formed a relationship with her Spanish confessor, Father Miguel de Molinos. The resulting pregnancy had been carefully managed to coincide with the king's presence at court, creating the illusion of legitimate royal succession. But the child born of this union possessed features so distinctly Spanish that concerns arose immediately. The infant's survival posed a threat to the carefully constructed mythology of divine right that surrounded the French monarchy. A decision was made at the highest levels of government to declare the child stillborn while secretly arranging for its removal from France. Fouquet's investigation revealed that the child had been transported to Spain under the protection of the Duke of Medina Sidonia, a man whose loyalty to the Spanish crown was matched only by his hatred of French expansion. The boy was raised in a monastery and told that he was the bastard son of a Spanish nobleman, unaware of his true heritage and the revolutionary implications of his existence. The former superintendent's research had uncovered another disturbing detail. The child bore a facial resemblance to Louis XIV, that was so pronounced it could not be explained by mere coincidence. This resemblance suggested a shared heritage that went beyond their mutual connection to the Queen. Fouquet began to suspect that the Spanish confessor himself might have had some blood connection to the French royal line, perhaps through one of the numerous illegitimate offspring that had peppered European nobility for centuries. As Fouquet prepared to reveal his findings, he became aware that his activities had not gone unnoticed. Pignerol welcomed a new prisoner, a young man with a black velvet mask covering his face at all times. The prisoner's treatment was extraordinary. He was afforded privileges usually reserved for nobility, yet his identity remained completely hidden. Fouquet started to suspect that his own investigations might have a connection to this masked figure. The masked prisoner's mannerisms and bearing suggested aristocratic breeding, but there was something else, a nervous energy that spoke of recent trauma. When he spoke, which was rare, his voice carried the cultured tones of someone educated in multiple languages. Yet there was a haunted quality to his demeanour, as if he carried knowledge that was too dangerous to share. Through the complex system of communication that prisoners develop over time, Fouquet began to piece together fragments of the masked man's story. He had been captured in Spain under mysterious circumstances, brought to France in secret, and imprisoned under the direct orders of the king himself. The level of security surrounding his custody was unprecedented, suggesting that his identity posed a threat to the very stability of the realm. As winter deepened, Fouquet made a connection that deeply chilled him. The timing of the masked prisoner's arrival corresponded exactly with reports of a young man's disappearance from a Spanish monastery. The physical description, gleaned from carefully orchestrated glimpses, matched the accounts of the Spanish prince that Fouquet had been investigating. The former superintendent realized that he might be sharing his prison with the very person whose existence threatened to unravel the legitimacy of the French monarchy. The masked prisoner represented more than just a political inconvenience. He embodied the secrets that powerful men were willing to sacrifice their lives to safeguard. The mask was not merely a punishment, it was a necessity, hiding a face that could topple dynasties. In the shadows of Pignerol, two men carried secrets that could reshape Europe, each unaware of how their fates had become intertwined in the deadly game of royal succession. Father Miguel de Molinos walked through the corridors of the Escorial with the measured pace of a man who had long ago learned to hide his true thoughts behind a mask of pious devotion. The Spanish royal palace, with its austere granite walls and labyrinthine passages, seemed designed to muffle secrets, and Molinos had grown comfortable in its shadowed embrace. What he had not anticipated was the arrival of a French spy who knew far too much about events that were supposed to have been buried with the passage of time. The Jesuit priest paused before a portrait of Queen Maria Theresa, studying the Habsburg features that had been faithfully rendered by court artists. The irony was not lost on him. He had helped create a living version of this portrait, a young man whose existence now threatened to unravel the carefully constructed balance of European power. The child, born of his liaison with the French Queen, carried not just his features, but also the unmistakable stamp of royal blood that made him both precious and dangerous. Molinos had never intended to become entangled in matters of state. His original mission in France had been purely spiritual, to serve as confessor to the lonely Spanish princess who had been married off to secure peace between two great powers. But Maria Theresa's isolation at Versailles had created an intimacy that transcended the boundaries of their formal relationship. Their connection had been intellectual at first, then emotional, and finally physical, resulting in consequences that neither had fully anticipated. The pregnancy had been managed with the skill of practiced courtiers. Louis XIV's own physician, Dr. Fagan, had been complicit in the deception, ensuring that the timing appeared to coincide with the king's presence. But the child's Spanish features had been immediately apparent, creating a crisis that required swift and decisive action. Within hours of the infant's birth, only a handful of individuals knew the truth, leading to the decision to fake his death. Molinos had watched helplessly as his son was spirited away to Spain and placed in the care of the Benedictine monastery of San Pedro de Cardeña. The arrangement had been presented as a charitable act, the rescue of an orphaned child whose parents had died in service to the crown. The abbot, a man of unquestioning loyalty to the Spanish royal family, had asked no probing questions about the boy's origins or the generous endowment that accompanied his arrival. For 20 years, Molinos had watched from afar as his son grew to manhood, receiving reports from the monastery that described a young man of exceptional intelligence and natural leadership. The boy had been told that he was the illegitimate son of a Spanish nobleman who had died in the wars with France, a fiction that explained both his comfortable circumstances and his uncertain status. He had been given the name Eustache d'Auga, a combination that honoured both his Spanish heritage and his French birth. The deception had worked perfectly until the network of spies and informants that peppered European courts began to notice certain patterns. Fouquet's investigation initially posed a serious threat, but his imprisonment and disgrace effectively contained it. The real danger had come from an unexpected source. Eustache d'Auga himself had begun to ask questions about his parentage, driven by a growing awareness that his physical resemblance to the French king was too pronounced to be coincidental. Molinos had tried to discourage these inquiries, but the young man's persistence had eventually attracted the attention of Spanish intelligence networks. The Duke of Medina Sidonia, ever alert to opportunities that might damage French interests, had seen immediately the potential for chaos. A living claimant to the French throne, even an illegitimate one, could be used to foment rebellion, or at least create sufficient doubt about royal succession to weaken Louis XIV's position. The situation had become even more complex when French agents learned of the threat. Minister Louvois, whose network of spies was arguably the most sophisticated in Europe, had dispatched operatives to Spain with orders to eliminate the problem permanently. The young man's life had suddenly become the focal point of an international incident that could easily escalate into open warfare. But Molinos had received intelligence that suggested an even more dangerous development. French agents had captured the real Eustache d'Auga, the valet who served as a spy for Fouquet, and were holding him in the fortress of Pignerol. His capture meant that two men now bore the same name, one the innocent son of a Spanish priest and French queen, the other a seasoned spy who possessed knowledge that could expose the entire conspiracy. The priest realized that the French authorities had likely confused the two men, or perhaps had deliberately chosen to imprison them both to prevent any possibility of the truth emerging. The masked prisoner that reports described could be either man or both men might be held in separate locations to ensure that their stories could never be compared or corroborated. As Molinos contemplated the terrible irony of the situation, he began to understand that his survival depended on ensuring that neither version of Eustache d'Auga ever revealed the truth. The secrets they carried were too dangerous for any of them to survive their exposure. Louis XIV stood at the window of his private study in Versailles, watching the sun set over the geometric perfection of his gardens. Louis XIV, who had dubbed himself the Sun King, was acutely aware of the irony, a crisis that threatened to overshadow his meticulously crafted mythology of divine authority. The dispatch from Minister Louvois lay open on his desk, its contents more disturbing than any military defeat or diplomatic setback he had yet endured. Initially, the discovery of a young man with his facial features in Spanish territory appeared to be a manageable issue. Royal bastards were common enough in European courts, and the resemblance could be dismissed as coincidence or wishful thinking by enemies seeking to undermine French authority. But the accompanying intelligence had painted a far more complex and dangerous picture. The young man was not merely a bastard who happened to resemble the king. According to Louvois' agents, he was the son of Queen Maria Theresa and her Spanish confessor, born in 1661 and secretly transported to Spain to prevent a succession crisis. The implications were staggering. If this information became public, it would not only delegitimize the Dauphin's claim to the throne, but would also provide Spain with a potential weapon that could be used to challenge French authority for generations. Louis had always taken pride in his ability to separate personal emotions from matters of state, but this crisis profoundly affected the essence of his identity. The Queen's betrayal, if true, was a wound that cut deeper than any military defeat. More troubling still was the possibility that the young man's resemblance to him might indicate a blood connection that went beyond their shared relationship to Maria Theresa. The king's private investigations had uncovered disturbing genealogical connections that his historians had previously overlooked. Father Molinos, the Spanish confessor, was descended from a cadet branch of the Bourbon family through his grandmother, a woman who had been the mistress of Louis XIII's younger brother. This meant that the priest carried French royal blood, albeit diluted through illegitimate channels. The child born of his union with the Queen would therefore possess a double claim to royal heritage, making him not just a bastard, but a potential rival with legitimate grievances. The capture of the real Eustache d'Alga had provided Louis with additional intelligence about the conspiracy, but it had also complicated the situation immeasurably. The spy's confessions, extracted through careful interrogation, revealed that Spanish agents had been planning to use the young man as a rallying point for territorial claims in southern France. The Duke of Medina Sidonia had been secretly gathering support among Spanish nobles who still harboured resentment over territorial losses from recent wars. But d'Alga's revelations had also exposed a network of French nobles who might be sympathetic to a Spanish claimant. The list of potential conspirators included some of the most powerful families in France, men whose loyalty Louis had never questioned, but whose ambitions might make them receptive to supporting a rival claimant who could advance their interests. The king faced a dilemma that challenged every principle of his reign. The young man's execution would be the simplest solution, but it would also create a martyr whose death might inspire even greater opposition. Also, the execution method must be carefully managed to prevent the body from being examined by those who might recognize the royal features. Imprisonment presented its challenges. Any guard or official would immediately recognize the implications when they saw the young man's striking resemblance to Louis. The solution that had been implemented, the black velvet mask, was both practical and symbolic. It prevented recognition, while also serving as a constant reminder of the terrible knowledge that lay beneath. Yet Louis understood that the mask was only a temporary solution. The young man's very existence represented a threat that would persist as long as he lived. Every day of his continued survival increased the risk that the truth would eventually emerge, either through careless talk among his guards or through the persistent investigations of hostile foreign agents. The king had also considered the possibility of using the masked prisoner as a bargaining chip in future negotiations with Spain. The young man's value as a hostage was considerable, particularly if Spanish agents were indeed planning to use him as a claimant to French territory. But this approach carried its own risks. Acknowledging the prisoner's identity, even in secret diplomatic channels, would confirm the very allegations that Louis was trying to suppress. As the sun disappeared behind the horizon, Louis made a decision that would echo through the corridors of European power for generations. The masked prisoner would remain imprisoned, his identity hidden, his very existence denied. The secret would be shared only among a handful of the most trusted officials, men whose own survival depended on maintaining the fiction that had been constructed around the mysterious figure. The Sun King had chosen to preserve his dynasty through the systematic erasure of a rival claimant, but he understood that this decision would bind him and his successors to a conspiracy that could never be fully resolved. The masked prisoner would serve as a constant reminder of the vulnerability of royal authority and the high cost of preserving power in a time of secrecy and deceit. The Palazzo Ducale stood reflected in the murky waters of the Grand Canal, its Gothic arches catching the morning light like ancient eyes watching the eternal dance of commerce and conspiracy that defined Venice. Count Antonio Mattioli, the Duke of Mantua's most trusted diplomat, stood at his window studying the coded dispatch that had arrived with the dawn tide. The message, bearing the seal of the Spanish crown, contained information that could either secure his fortune or guarantee his death. Mattioli had built his career on the principle that information was the most valuable commodity in the complex web of Italian politics. His network of contacts stretched from the Ottoman court to the chambers of the Pope, each relationship carefully cultivated to provide him with the intelligence necessary to navigate the treacherous waters of European diplomacy. But the offer contained in this latest correspondence was unlike anything he had previously encountered. The Spanish crown was prepared to pay an extraordinary sum for the delivery of a single individual, a young man currently held in French custody, whose identity was so sensitive that even the dispatch referred to him only as the masked one. The amount mentioned was sufficient to purchase a small duchy, but Mattioli understood that such generosity came with proportional risks. The French were not known for their forgiveness of those who interfered with their state security. The Count's investigations had revealed disturbing details about the prisoner's background. Through his contacts in the Jesuit order, he had learned that the young man was connected to Father Molinos, the Spanish confessor whose relationship with the French Queen had created one of the most explosive scandals in recent memory. The prisoner's physical resemblance to Louis XIV was so pronounced that it could only be explained by royal blood, making him both incredibly valuable and impossibly dangerous. Mattioli's plan was audacious in its simplicity. The fortress of Pignerol, where the masked prisoner was held, was situated in territory that had changed hands multiple times during recent conflicts. The Italian count possessed detailed maps of the region, including passages that had been used by smugglers and refugees during the various sieges. More importantly, he had cultivated relationships with several guards at the fortress, men whose loyalty could be purchased for the right price. The timing of the proposed rescue was crucial. Intelligence suggested that the French were planning to transfer the masked prisoner to a more secure location, possibly the Bastille in Paris. Once the move was completed, any rescue attempt would become infinitely more difficult. The window of opportunity was narrow, perhaps only a few weeks during which the prisoner would be vulnerable to a carefully orchestrated extraction. But Mattioli had not survived decades of Italian politics by acting impulsively. His own investigations had revealed that the Spanish offer was not the only game being played around the masked prisoner. French agents were actively seeking to eliminate potential threats to their security, and the Count's inquiries had likely attracted their attention. More troubling still, he had detected signs that other parties were also interested in the prisoner's fate. The Venetian Republic, ever alert to opportunities that might advance their interests, had apparently learned of the prisoner's existence through their intelligence networks. The Doge's agents had approached Mattioli with a counter-offer. They would support his rescue attempt in exchange for the prisoner being delivered to Venice rather than Spain. The Republic's interest was purely strategic. They saw the masked man as a potential tool for disrupting the balance of power between France and Spain. The Count found himself at the centre of a complex web of competing interests, each faction seeking to use him to advance their agenda. The Spanish wanted the prisoner as a potential claimant to challenge French authority. The Venetians viewed him as a valuable tool for future negotiations. The French, of course, wanted him dead or permanently silenced. Mattioli began to realize that his survival might depend on playing these factions against each other, rather than committing fully to any single course of action. Examining the architectural plans of Pignerol, Mattioli discovered a detail that previous intelligence reports had missed. The fortress contained a series of underground chambers that had been constructed during the medieval period, long before the current security arrangements had been implemented. These chambers connected to natural caves that extended beyond the fortress walls, potentially providing a route for extraction that would avoid the heavily guarded main entrances. The Count's network of contacts included a group of former soldiers who had served in various conflicts throughout northern Italy. These men, scarred by years of warfare and motivated primarily by financial gain, possessed the skills necessary to execute a complex rescue operation. More importantly, they had no political loyalties that might compromise the mission or expose Mattioli to future blackmail. But as the Count refined his plans, he began to suspect that his activities had not gone unnoticed. French agents had been asking questions about him in various diplomatic circles, and several of his usual contacts had become suddenly unavailable. Realizing that he might already be under surveillance compelled him to reevaluate the entire operation. Executing the masked prisoner's rescue with precision was crucial, as it could potentially lead to his own imprisonment or death. The Venetian gambit was about to begin, but Mattioli understood that he was wagering not just his fortune, but his life on the outcome of a game whose rules were written by men who would not hesitate to sacrifice him if it served their purposes. The year 1703 brought an unusual warmth to the stones of the Bastille, as if the fortress itself were preparing for the end of its most enigmatic chapter. Saint-Marc stood in the courtyard, watching the masked prisoner take his final walk in the autumn sunlight. The man's gait had grown unsteady recently, his once proud bearing now bent with the weight of 34 years of anonymity. Yet there remained something indefinably regal in his movements, a quality that had never diminished despite the systematic erasure of his identity. The governor had received new instructions from Versailles, orders that carried the unmistakable tone of finality. The prisoner's health was failing, and the king's ministers had decided that his death should be carefully managed to prevent any posthumous revelations. The mask that had hidden his features for so long would be destroyed, his body buried under a false name, and all records of his true identity would be sealed in the royal archives in perpetuity. But Saint-Mars had been keeping his own records, a private journal that documented the small details of the prisoner's daily life. The man's habits, his preferences, and his reactions to news from the outside world. All these fragments painted a portrait of someone who had once moved in the highest circles of European society. The prisoner's knowledge of courtly etiquette was impeccable, his understanding of diplomatic protocols comprehensive, and his reactions to news of Spanish affairs particularly intense. The breakthrough had come through an unexpected source. Father Griffith, the Jesuit priest who served as the prisoner's confessor, had inadvertently revealed details that confirmed Saint-Mars' growing suspicions. During the prisoner's final illness, when fever had loosened his tongue, he had spoken in his delirium of memories that could only belong to someone who had lived at the very heart of royal power. He had mentioned specific events, private conversations, and intimate details about the French court that no ordinary criminal could have known. Most revealing of all, the prisoner had spoken of his mother, not in the vague terms of distant memory, but with the specific grief of someone who had been forced to abandon a beloved parent. He had described her voice, her hands, and her particular way of blessing herself before meals. The details were too precise, too emotionally charged to be fabrications. Saint-Mars had begun to understand that the masked prisoner was not merely someone who resembled the royal family, he was a member of it. An aging servant who had worked in the royal nursery during the 1660s had provided the final piece of the puzzle. The woman, now in her 70s and dying of consumption, had sought out Saint-Mars to unburden herself of a secret that had tormented her for decades. She had been present at the birth of a child to Queen Maria Theresa in 1661, a child whose Spanish features had immediately marked him as different from the Dauphin, who had been born the previous year. The servant's account corroborated the intelligence reports that Saint-Mars had been piecing together. The child had been declared stillborn, but she had seen him breathing and had watched as he was spirited away by figures she had not recognized. The official records had been falsified, the attending physician sworn to secrecy, and the entire incident buried beneath layers of royal protocol and state necessity. But the servant's revelation had contained an additional detail that reframed the entire mystery. The child's father was not Father Molinos, as the intelligence reports had suggested, but Louis XIV himself. The Queen's relationship with her Spanish confessor had been real, but it had been a spiritual rather than physical connection. The child bore Spanish features because he had inherited them from his mother, but his resemblance to the king was unmistakable because Louis XIV was indeed his father. This revelation transformed the prisoner's story from one of illegitimate birth to one of legitimate succession. The masked man was not a bastard who threatened the dynasty. He was a rightful heir who had been sacrificed to maintain the fiction of royal perfection. His imprisonment was not punishment for his mother's adultery, but protection for a state secret that could have destabilized the entire kingdom. The child's Spanish appearance had been deemed unacceptable for a future king of France. In an age when royal marriages were diplomatic instruments and royal children were symbols of national identity, a dauphin who looked more Spanish than French would have been a constant reminder of France's subordinate position in the marriage alliance. The decision to hide his existence had been made not from shame, but from political necessity. Saint-Mars realized that the prisoner's education and bearing made perfect sense in this context. He had been raised by carefully selected tutors who had trained him for a role he could never claim, educated in the arts of kingship, while being permanently denied the throne. The cruelty of this arrangement was breathtaking, to create a perfect prince and then condemn him to spend his life hidden behind a mask. As the prisoner drew his final breaths, Saint-Mars understood that he was witnessing the end of one of history's most elaborate cover-ups. The man dying in the Bastille was not a criminal or a spy, but a king who had never been allowed to rule. His death would close the final chapter of a story that had begun with the political calculations of absolute monarchy and ended with the quiet tragedy of a life sacrificed to the needs of state. The mask that had hidden his features would be destroyed, his grave would bear a false name, and history would remember him only as a mystery. But Saint-Mars knew the truth, and he understood that the real tragedy was not the prisoner's death, but the kingdom's loss of what might have been its greatest king. Brother Matthias pressed his quill against the parchment, ink pooling like a small wound. The monastery scriptorium felt unusually quiet this July morning, in 1518, as if the very walls held their breath. Outside Strasbourg's timber-framed houses, something unprecedented was unfolding, something that would challenge every assumption about human nature, divine will, and the boundaries between reason and chaos. The woman had begun 3 days prior. Frau Trophäa, a baker's wife, whose hands had kneaded thousands of loaves and whose feet had walked the cobblestones in measured steps for 43 years. Yet, on that sweltering Tuesday, those same feet had betrayed every principle of human dignity. They moved without her permission, lifting and stepping, turning and pivoting in patterns that belonged neither to any known dance nor to any recognizable madness. Matthias had witnessed possession before. The monastery served as refuge for those touched by devils, those whose minds had fractured under the weight of worldly concerns. But the dancing differed fundamentally from the thrashing, incoherent movements of the afflicted. Frau Trophäa's dance possessed an almost mathematical precision, as if her body followed instructions written in a language only her muscles could read. The crowd that gathered around her grew throughout that first day. Initially, neighbours assumed she celebrated some private joy, perhaps news of a pregnancy after years of barrenness, or word that her husband's debts had been forgiven. But as hours passed without pause, without water or rest, their smiles transformed into frowns of concern, then masks of fear. Dr. Hieronymus Bock, the city's most respected physician, arrived before sunset. His examination revealed no fever, no signs of ergot poisoning from contaminated grain, and no symptoms of St. Vitus's dance. Her pulse remained steady despite the continuous exertion. Although her eyes appeared wild, they tracked movement and responded to sound. Most puzzling of all, when spoken to directly, she could respond coherently, even as her body continued its relentless choreography. "I cannot stop," she gasped between movements that resembled a peasant reel crossed with something far more ancient. "My feet, they know something I do not." By the second day, 3 others had joined her. Hans Burkhardt, a blacksmith, was among them, his powerful frame making his graceful pirouettes seem almost blasphemous. Elisabeth Zimmern, who was barely 16, performed a dance that resembled a courtly pavane. Most disturbing of all was Father Wilhelm, whose ecclesiastical robes billowed as he spun in movements that seemed to mock the very rituals he had performed for 20 years. The city council convened emergency sessions. The medical college debated theories ranging from corrupted humours to celestial malignment. The clergy declared days of prayer and fasting, yet nothing slowed the spreading contagion, which it certainly was, although it differed from any plague that had ever afflicted Christian lands. Brother Matthias found himself appointed as official recorder, tasked with documenting each new case, each development in what scholars were already calling the most significant mass affliction since the Children's Crusade. His training in both theology and natural philosophy positioned him uniquely to observe without predetermined judgment and to record without the filter of established doctrine. What he witnessed defied every category of human experience. The dancers, for lack of a better term, showed no signs of coordination, yet moved in patterns that occasionally synchronized. They ate when food was placed in their mouths, but seemed incapable of stopping to seek nourishment independently. Most unsettling, they appeared to find genuine joy in their condition, laughing and singing between bouts of exhaustion that would have felled any normal person. As his quill scratched across the parchment that would become one of history's most important primary sources, Matthias couldn't shake the feeling that he documented not merely an outbreak of collective madness, but something far more profound. The dancers moved as if responding to music only they could hear. as if their bodies had become instruments in some cosmic composition whose meaning remained tantalizingly beyond comprehension. The mystery had only begun to unfold. Within a week, the dancing had claimed 34 souls. Brother Matthias walked the streets each dawn, counting the swaying figures, noting the peculiar evolution of their movements. What had begun as individual expressions of inexplicable compulsion was developing into something resembling choreographed chaos. The city's response revealed the deep fractures in medieval understanding of human nature. Physicians clung to Galenic theories of humoral imbalance, prescribing bloodletting and purges that proved utterly ineffective. The clergy proclaimed the dancing a divine punishment for the city's moral failings, pointing to everything from excessive merchant profits to the popularity of secular music. Yet neither medical intervention nor spiritual remedies showed any impact on the spreading affliction. Most intriguing to Matthias was the pattern of contagion. The dance didn't spread through physical contact or proximity, as plagues typically did. Instead, it seemed to select its victims according to some hidden logic. Agnes Müller, a wealthy merchant's wife known for her charity work, began dancing while distributing bread to the poor, but her servants, who had closer contact with the afflicted, remained unaffected. Meanwhile, Klaus Weber, a solitary cobbler who rarely ventured from his workshop, suddenly appeared in the main square, his leather apron flying as he performed leaps that would have impressed the finest court entertainers. The dancers themselves provided few clues. During their brief moments of rest, never more than an hour and often far less, they spoke of dreams filled with music, of voices calling them to move, of an overwhelming sense that their dancing served some essential purpose they couldn't articulate. Frau Trophea, now entering her second week of continuous movement, claimed she could see patterns in the air itself, geometric shapes that guided her steps. It's not madness, she insisted to Dr. Bock during one of his increasingly frequent examinations. It's remembering. My body remembers something my mind forgot. The physician noted this comment in his records, along with his observation that the dancers showed remarkable physical resilience. Despite consuming minimal food and water, despite dancing through the heat of July days and the cool of summer nights, none showed signs of the exhaustion that should have killed them days ago. Their feet, which should have been bloodied stumps, remained intact. Their hearts, which should have burst from the exertion, beat with steady rhythm. Local authorities faced an impossible situation. The dancing disrupted commerce, frightened visitors, and challenged the social order. Yet the dancers committed no crime beyond the violation of public decorum. They harmed no one, stole nothing, preached no heresy. How do you arrest someone whose only offence is an inability to stand still? The guild masters demanded action. The bakers complained that the dancing crowds frightened customers. The weavers reported decreased productivity as workers abandoned their looms to watch the spectacle. The church worried about declining attendance at services, though ironically many citizens spent more time in prayer, begging God to spare them from joining the dance. Young Elisabeth Zimmer's case particularly troubled Matthias. The girl came from a respectable family, had shown no signs of mental instability, and had been betrothed to a goldsmith's son just weeks before her affliction began. Yet when her parents and fiancé pleaded with her to stop, she could only weep while her body continued its measured movements. "I want to stop," she sobbed. "But the music, can't you hear it? It's so beautiful, and it says I must dance until something happens. Something important." The goldsmith's son, Johann, maintained a vigil beside her, bringing water and food, wiping her tears, even attempting to hold her still through sheer physical force. Nothing worked. Eventually he began moving to her rhythm, swaying slightly as he sat beside her. Matthias watched this development with growing alarm, wondering if Johann might become the next victim. Dr. Bock proposed an experiment. If the dancing represented some form of musical enchantment, perhaps counter-music might provide relief. He hired the city's best musicians to play calming melodies near the dancers, hoping to break whatever spell held them. The result was catastrophic. The moment the first note sounded, every dancer stopped. For 30 heartbeats, silence filled the square. Then, as if responding to some unheard conductor's baton, they began dancing with renewed vigour, their movements now synchronized to the musicians' playing. The music seemed to feed the affliction rather than cure it. That night, 3 musicians joined the dancers. Dr. Hieronymus Bock had studied at the finest universities in Europe. He had treated plague victims in Vienna, examined cases of ergotism in Bavaria, and corresponded with physicians from Paris to Prague. Yet the dancing plague challenged every principle of medical knowledge he had accumulated over 30 years of practice. His detailed observations, preserved in the monastery archives, provide the most systematic analysis of the phenomenon. The dancers showed no fever, no delirium, and no physical abnormalities beyond their compulsive movement. Their pulse rates, while elevated during active dancing, remained within survivable ranges. Most puzzling is that their bodies adapted to the continuous exertion in ways that defied physiological understanding. The human form is not designed for such prolonged activity, he wrote to his former professor at the University of Basel. Yet these individuals show no signs of the muscle deterioration, dehydration, or cardiac distress that should accompany such exertion. It is as if their bodies have entered some altered state that suspends normal biological limitations. Bock's attempts at treatment revealed the inadequacy of contemporary medical theory. Bloodletting, the universal remedy for humoral imbalance, produced no change in the dancer's condition. Purges and emetics failed to expel whatever poison might have caused the affliction. Even trepanation, performed on one willing volunteer, merely added a head wound to his list of ailments without diminishing his need to dance. The physician began to suspect that the dancing plague represented something entirely outside the realm of traditional medicine. His correspondence with Brother Matthias reveals a growing fascination with the metaphysical implications of the outbreak. What if this condition originates not in the body but in some faculty of the soul we do not yet understand, he speculated. The dancers speak consistently of hearing music, of seeing patterns, of following instructions that come from within rather than without. Perhaps we witness not disease but revelation. This theory gained support from an unexpected source. Rabbi Mordecai ben Avraham, Strasbourg's most learned Jewish scholar, approached Bock with references from ancient texts describing similar phenomena. The Talmud mentioned cases of compulsive dancing associated with divine visions. Kabbalistic texts described states of spiritual ecstasy that manifested through involuntary movement. Islamic scholars in nearby territories reported historical accounts of Sufi mystics whose dancing induced transcendent experiences. Perhaps, the rabbi suggested, these people have stumbled into a state of consciousness that mystics spend lifetimes trying to achieve. Bock found this perspective intriguing but problematic. The dancers showed none of the traditional signs of mystical experience. They reported no visions of divine beings, no prophecies, no unusual wisdom or insight. Instead, they seemed trapped in a state that brought neither spiritual enlightenment nor physical relief. The physician's most significant breakthrough came through careful observation of the dancers' interactions with each other. Despite the apparent randomness of their movements, patterns emerged. Dancers who had been strangers before their affliction began to move in complementary rhythms. Their individual dances gradually synchronized, creating complex group choreographies that seemed to serve some unifying purpose. Margaret Lohner, a widow who had joined the dancers in the 3rd week, provided crucial testimony during one of her brief rest periods. "We are pieces of something larger," she gasped. "Each dance is a part, but we cannot see the whole. Only when we all move together does the true pattern emerge." Bock began mapping the dancers' positions and movements, creating diagrams that revealed an underlying geometry to their apparently chaotic activity. The patterns resembled mathematical principles he had encountered in architectural texts. Golden ratios, spiral sequences, harmonic proportions that appeared throughout nature. This discovery led to a disturbing realization. If the dancing followed mathematical laws, it might not be random affliction but rather the manifestation of some deeper order. The dancers might be unconsciously creating a physical representation of abstract principles, their bodies serving as instruments in a vast calculation whose purpose remained hidden. The implications terrified both physician and scholar. If human beings could be compelled to serve as components in some larger system without their conscious awareness, what did this suggest about free will, about the nature of individual identity, about humanity's place in the cosmic order? As July drew to a close with over 60 dancers now active in Strasbourg's streets, Bock abandoned his attempts at medical treatment. Instead, he focused on documentation, convinced that he witnessed not disease but discovery, the unveiling of some fundamental aspect of human nature that had remained hidden until this extraordinary moment. The mystery was deepening rather than resolving, and the implications grew more unsettling with each passing day. The ecclesiastical response to the dancing plague exposed deep theological tensions within the church. Brother Matthias found himself at the centre of heated debates between different factions of clergy, each proposing radically different interpretations of the unprecedented phenomenon. Bishop Johann Weidmann initially declared the dancing a manifestation of demonic possession, ordering exorcisms and public prayers for the afflicted. Yet, when Father Wilhelm, one of the diocese's most respected priests, joined the dancers, this explanation became untenable. How could a man who had spent decades fighting evil suddenly succumb to it? The dancing father continued to recite prayers and bless those who approached him, even as his body swayed in patterns that seemed to mock ecclesiastical dignity. Prior Benedict, head of Matthias's monastery, proposed an alternative theory rooted in mystical tradition. Perhaps God tests our understanding, he suggested during a chapter meeting. Scripture tells us David danced before the Lord with all his might. The prophets often receive divine communication through ecstatic states. What if these dancers have been chosen to receive revelation in a form we do not yet comprehend? An unexpected source of support for this perspective emerged. Sister Johanna of the nearby convent of St. Agnes reported that several nuns had experienced powerful spiritual visions while observing the dancers. During their regular hours of prayer, they found themselves moving in subtle rhythms that seemed to echo the dancers' movements. Most significantly, they reported an enhanced sense of divine presence during these experiences. When I allow my body to respond to the rhythm I perceive in their dancing, Sister Johanna testified, my prayers become more profound, my connection to the Creator more immediate. It is as if their movements create a bridge between earthly and heavenly realms. Yet this mystical interpretation faced strong opposition from the Dominican friars, who saw in the dancing a dangerous form of enthusiasm that threatened church authority. Brother Heinrich, their most vocal spokesman, argued that any spiritual experience not mediated through established religious channels must be viewed with extreme suspicion. These dancers claim to receive instruction directly from some divine or cosmic source, he declared during a public sermon. They circumvent the sacraments, disregard clerical guidance, and adhere to impulses that might stem from the depths of hell. If we accept their claims, we undermine the very foundation of Christian order. The theological debate intensified when several dancers began incorporating religious gestures into their movements. They crossed themselves while spinning, genuflected during leaps, and raised their arms in positions reminiscent of crucifixion. Yet these sacred elements appeared seamlessly woven into dance patterns that retained their essentially secular character. Matthias observed these developments with growing fascination. The dancers seemed to access some form of religious expression that transcended traditional categories. Their movement prayers appeared simultaneously more primitive and more sophisticated than conventional worship, as if they had discovered a method of spiritual communication that predated organized religion yet pointed towards some more evolved form of divine encounter. The situation became even more complex when Rabbi Mordecai reported similar theological discussions within the Jewish community. Several respected Torah scholars had begun incorporating swaying movements into their study sessions, claiming that physical rhythm enhanced their ability to penetrate sacred texts. The Kabbalistic tradition of meditative movement suddenly seemed directly relevant to current events. Perhaps, the rabbi suggested to Matthias during one of their regular conversations, we witness the emergence of a universal spiritual language that transcends the boundaries between our different faiths. The dancers may be unconsciously recovering ancient forms of worship that were practiced before religious traditions became institutionalized. This possibility alarmed both Christian and Jewish authorities. If the dancing represented some primordial form of spiritual expression, it potentially challenged the legitimacy of all established religious institutions. The dancer's apparent ability to access transcendent experiences without priestly mediation suggested that formal religious structures might be unnecessary, or even obstacles to genuine spiritual encounter. The controversy reached a crescendo when young Elisabeth Zimmern began speaking in what appeared to be unknown languages during her dance. Linguistic scholars determined that her utterances followed consistent grammatical patterns but corresponded to no known human tongue. Church authorities faced the uncomfortable possibility that she spoke in the tongues of angels mentioned in Scripture, yet outside any recognized ecclesiastical context. Bishop Weidmann found himself in an impossible position. He could not condemn phenomena that might represent genuine divine communication, yet he could not endorse activities that undermined church authority. His compromise solution satisfied no one. He declared the dancing neither inherently sacred nor profane, but rather a mysterious manifestation that required careful study before any definitive theological judgment could be made. This official position of studied neutrality reflected the broader uncertainty that gripped all of Strasbourg's intellectual and spiritual leaders. The dancing plague had revealed the inadequacy of every existing framework for understanding human behavior and divine interaction. As July turned to August, with the number of dancers approaching 100, it became clear that the phenomenon would not be easily contained within familiar categories of explanation. The sacred and profane were merging in ways that challenged the very foundations of medieval worldview, and no one could predict where this unprecedented fusion might lead. The Strasbourg City Council faced an administrative nightmare without precedent in municipal law. How do you govern a population increasingly composed of individuals who cannot control their own movements? By early August 1518, nearly 100 citizens danced continuously through the streets, creating chaos that threatened the city's economic and social stability. Magistrate Conrad Wickram, elected to office based on his reputation for practical problem-solving, found every conventional solution ineffective. His first approach had been straightforward law enforcement: arrest the dancers for disturbing the peace. However, the city jail could not accommodate 100 prisoners, especially prisoners who required constant supervision and continued to dance within their cells. Moreover, the legal precedent was unclear. Medieval law addressed theft, assault, heresy, and various forms of misconduct, but nowhere in legal tradition could the magistrates find guidance for dealing with compulsive dancing. The guild masters presented increasingly desperate petitions. The bakers reported significant losses as crowds of spectators made normal business impossible. The cloth merchants complained that trade delegations from other cities were avoiding Strasbourg, fearing contamination by whatever affliction caused the dancing. Most seriously, agricultural workers from surrounding villages were abandoning their harvest duties, drawn to the city by reports of the miraculous dancing. If this continues through harvest season, warned Johann Zeckler, master of the Farmers' Guild, we face not merely economic disruption but potential famine. The dancers consume resources while producing nothing. Worse, they inspire others to abandon productive labour in favour of gawking at this spectacle. Wickram's attempts at practical solutions revealed the phenomenon's resistance to conventional intervention. He hired additional musicians, reasoning that if dancing was inevitable, perhaps organised music might channel it in less disruptive directions. This backfired spectacularly when the musicians themselves became infected and joined the ranks of the uncontrollably dancing. The magistrate then attempted to confine the dancers to a specific area outside the city walls, hoping to minimise their impact on daily commerce. However, the dancers showed no awareness of artificial boundaries. They moved according to internal imperatives that paid no attention to human attempts at crowd control. Guards assigned to maintain containment found themselves gradually swaying to the rhythm of the dancers' movements, requiring frequent rotation to prevent further infections. Legal scholars consulted ancient Roman law, canon law, and traditional Germanic customs, finding no precedent for the current situation. The dancers committed no crime, yet violated social order. They harmed no one yet endangered public welfare. They followed no leader, yet moved with apparent coordination. Every category of legal classification proved inadequate. Dr. Bock's medical reports complicated attempts at legal resolution. His documentation demonstrated that the dancers suffered from no disease that legal authorities could reasonably quarantine. They showed no signs of madness that would justify confinement to asylums. Most problematically, they retained enough mental capacity to make their own decisions about most matters. They simply could not control their compulsive movement. The situation deteriorated when several city council members began showing signs of rhythmic susceptibility. Observers noticed Councilman Peter Imlin swaying during official meetings, his foot tapping in patterns that appeared to mimic the dancers' rhythms. Rather than acknowledge this development, the council implemented new procedures requiring all members to remain seated and still during deliberations, with guards instructed to intervene if anyone showed signs of unusual movement. Economic pressure mounted as trade relationships suffered. Merchants from Basel and Frankfurt reported to their city councils that Strasbourg had become a city possessed, discouraging commercial interaction until the crisis resolved. The annual harvest fair, crucial to the region's economy, faced potential cancellation as participating merchants expressed reluctance to enter a city where they might become infected with uncontrollable dancing. Wickram's most creative solution involved attempting to negotiate directly with the dancers. Perhaps reasoning could succeed where force had failed. He organised formal meetings where city representatives attempted to discuss the situation with dancers during their brief rest periods. These conversations proved profoundly unsettling. The dancers consistently expressed their desire to stop, their awareness of the disruption they caused, and their complete inability to control their condition. Yet they also described their dancing as serving some essential purpose that they could not fully articulate. They spoke of participating in something larger than themselves, of their movements contributing to some vast pattern whose completion remained necessary. "Stop," you say, "but we can't stop any more than you can stop your heart," said Frau Trofea. This dancing is not our choice. It is our function. When the pattern is complete, we will rest. Until then, we must continue. When pressed to explain what pattern they meant, the dancers could offer only vague descriptions of geometric shapes, musical harmonies, and mathematical relationships that their bodies somehow expressed through movement. Their testimony suggested they served as unwilling participants in some cosmic calculation whose nature remained beyond human comprehension. The council's final attempt at resolution involved consulting authorities from other cities that had experienced similar phenomena. Historical research uncovered scattered reports of dancing outbreaks across European history, yet no detailed documentation was available to offer valuable guidance. Moreover, previous episodes had apparently resolved spontaneously, offering little insight into effective intervention strategies. By late August, Magistrate Wickram privately admitted defeat. The city government could neither stop the dancing nor effectively manage its consequences. They could only hope the phenomenon would end as mysteriously as it began, leaving them to deal with the aftermath. The authorities' inability to address the crisis reflected a deeper failure of medieval institutions to comprehend emerging realities that transcended traditional categories of understanding. September brought an unexpected development that changed everything Brother Matthias thought he understood about the dancing plague. The revelation came not through scholarly analysis or medical examination, but through the observations of an unlikely witness, Master Johann Gutenberg, a visiting printer investigating Strasbourg's potential as a location for his revolutionary, movable type workshop. Gutenberg possessed a unique perspective, shaped by his work with mechanical systems, mathematical precision, and pattern recognition essential to printing technology. While other observers focused on individual dancers or small groups, he studied the overall configuration of all dancers throughout the city. His trained eye, accustomed to detecting subtle alignments and spacing relationships, perceived something that had eluded everyone else. "They are not dancing randomly," he told Matthias during an evening meeting at the monastery. "From an elevated position, I observed from the cathedral tower, their movements create a vast geometric pattern that spans the entire city. Individual dancers serve as moving points in a complex diagram that appears to be nearing completion. Matthias initially dismissed this theory as fanciful speculation. However, Gutenberg's systematic documentation proved compelling. He had mapped the positions of all known dancers at regular intervals, creating a series of diagrams that revealed an underlying order to their apparently chaotic activity. The patterns resembled nothing in conventional human experience. They incorporated elements of sacred geometry, musical harmony, and mathematical principles that seemed almost too sophisticated for the medieval understanding. Yet the evidence was undeniable. The dancers were unconsciously creating a physical representation of abstract concepts that challenged the boundaries of contemporary knowledge. "Look at these measurements," Gutenberg explained, spreading his carefully drafted diagrams across the monastery table. The distances between dancers, the timing of their movements, the directions of their travel, everything follows precise mathematical relationships. They are drawing something in space and time, using their bodies as instruments in a calculation beyond human design. This discovery raised terrifying questions. If the dancers unconsciously followed mathematical laws, who or what had programmed these laws? The patterns were too complex, too purposeful to be accidental, yet they were also too alien to be products of human intelligence. The dancers themselves remained unaware of the larger design they were creating, responding to impulses they could not explain or control. Brother Matthias pondered the implications during sleepless nights. Were the dancers unwilling participants in some cosmic experiment? Had some intelligence, divine, demonic, or entirely other, selected Strasbourg as the site for a demonstration whose purpose remained hidden? The possibility that human beings could be manipulated like pieces on a chessboard challenged fundamental beliefs about free will and human dignity. Dr. Bock's medical observations supported Gutenberg's geometric analysis. The physician had noted that individual dancers' movements became increasingly precise over time, as if they were gradually learning to perform their roles more accurately. Their apparent fatigue seemed to diminish rather than increase, suggesting that their bodies were adapting to serve the requirements of the larger pattern. "They are becoming more efficient," Bock reported. "Their movements consume less energy while achieving greater precision. It is as if some process is optimizing their performance to serve functions we do not yet understand." The most unsettling aspect of Gutenberg's discovery was its progressive nature. The pattern was not static, but evolving, approaching some form of completion that might trigger unknown consequences. Based on the rate of change he had documented, the printer estimated that the geometric design would reach its final configuration within days. "What happens when the pattern is complete?" Matthias asked, though he feared the answer. Gutenberg could only speculate. Perhaps the dancers would finally be released from their compulsion. Perhaps the completion would trigger some larger event that the dancing had been designed to facilitate. Or perhaps the entire phenomenon would simply end, leaving behind only the memory of humanity's brief role as unwilling participants in some incomprehensible cosmic process. The printer's analysis also revealed why certain individuals were selected to become dancers, while others remained unaffected. The pattern required specific positions to be filled by dancers with particular physical characteristics, movement capabilities, and spatial relationships to other participants. The selection process had nothing to do with spiritual worthiness, moral character, or personal vulnerability. It was purely functional, based on requirements that remained hidden from human understanding. This mechanical view of the dancing plague stripped away all romantic or mystical interpretations. The dancers were not blessed visionaries or cursed victims. They were simply tools being used by some intelligence to create something beyond human comprehension. Their suffering, their loss of autonomy, their disruption of normal life served as acceptable costs in pursuing some larger objective. As September progressed, Gutenberg's predictions proved accurate. The dancers' movements became increasingly synchronized, their individual variations gradually harmonizing into a unified whole. The geometric pattern approached completion with mathematical inevitability, regardless of human attempts to understand or intervene. The residents of Strasbourg could only wait and wonder what would happen when the mysterious calculation finally reached its conclusion. The pattern that had claimed so many of their neighbours was nearly complete, and none could predict whether its fulfilment would bring liberation or catastrophe. October 15th, 1518. Brother Matthias recorded the date with a trembling hand, knowing he documented either the end of the most mysterious chapter in Strasbourg's history, or merely its transformation into something even more incomprehensible. The dancing plague, which had held the city captive for over 3 months, reached its conclusion in a manner that satisfied no theory and answered no questions. The end came with mathematical precision that confirmed Gutenberg's geometric analysis, while revealing its ultimate inadequacy. At exactly noon, when the cathedral bells announced the 6th hour, every dancer throughout the city stopped simultaneously. The dancers stopped not gradually, not individually, but in perfect unison, as if some cosmic conductor had finally lowered his baton. The silence that followed was more disturbing than the months of continuous movement had been. 137 people stood motionless in streets, squares, and courtyards throughout Strasbourg, their faces bearing expressions of profound confusion and loss. They looked around like dreamers awakening in unfamiliar surroundings, unable to reconcile their present situation with their last clear memories. Dr. Bock rushed to examine the former dancers, expecting to find signs of exhaustion, malnutrition, or physical damage from their prolonged ordeal. Instead, he discovered individuals in remarkably good health. Better health, in many cases, than they had enjoyed before their dancing began. Chronic ailments had disappeared. Old injuries had healed. Even elderly dancers showed renewed vitality that seemed to reverse months or years of aging. It is as if the dancing purified their bodies while enslaving their wills, Bock reported to the emergency council session convened that afternoon. They have been transformed by their experience in ways that challenge every principle of natural philosophy. Yet the physical improvements came with a price that became apparent only gradually. The former dancers retained no detailed memories of their time in the grip of the compulsion. They remembered beginning to dance, and they remembered the moment of release, but the months between remained largely blank, as if their consciousness had been suspended while their bodies served purposes beyond their understanding. Worrisomely, they reported enduring sensations, implying that their experience had not fully concluded. They felt perpetual awareness of subtle rhythms, faint melodies that seemed to emanate from the air itself. Some claimed they could still perceive the geometric patterns that had guided their movements, now visible as translucent overlays on the normal world. "The dancing has ended," Frau Troffea told Matthias during her first coherent interview, "but something remains. I feel expectant, as if we completed only the first movement of a longer composition." Elisabeth Simmons' testimony proved particularly unsettling. The young woman, whose graceful movements had captivated observers throughout the crisis, now possessed enhanced sensitivity to patterns and relationships that others could not perceive. She could predict weather changes days in advance, sense emotional states in people she had never met, and identify mathematical relationships in natural phenomena with uncanny accuracy. "The dancing taught us something," she explained, "not in words or thoughts, but in our bones, our blood, our deepest being. We learned a language that has no sounds, only movement and relationship and truth." Gutenberg's geometric analysis provided the only framework for understanding what had occurred. His final diagrams showed that the pattern created by the dancers' movements had indeed reached completion on October 15th. Yet completion had not resulted in dissolution, but rather in transformation. The physical dancing had ended, but it had apparently established something permanent, a new configuration of relationships that continued to influence the former dancers and, increasingly, the city itself. Over the following weeks, Strasbourg experienced subtle but significant changes. Trade negotiations proceeded more smoothly, as if commercial relationships had been somehow optimized. Conflicts between guildmasters resolved more easily. Even the weather seemed more favorable, with gentle rains arriving precisely when crops required moisture. Citizens began reporting unusually vivid dreams, enhanced creativity, and improved ability to understand complex problems. It was as if the completed geometric pattern, had created some form of beneficial resonance that enhanced human capabilities throughout the region. Yet these improvements carried an undercurrent of unease. If unknown intelligences could manipulate human beings to create patterns that then influenced entire communities, what did such behaviour suggest about human autonomy? Were the residents of Strasbourg now subject to guidance they could neither perceive nor resist? Brother Matthias completed his chronicle with more questions than answers. The dancing plague had ended, but its resolution raised more disturbing possibilities than its occurrence had. The dancers had been released from their compulsion, but they remained connected to whatever intelligence had choreographed their movements. The transformation of Strasbourg was complete, yet its nature and purpose remained a mystery. Most troubling of all, reports began arriving from other cities throughout the German states, describing unusual group behaviours, synchronized activities, and collective movements that seemed to echo Strasbourg's experience. Perhaps the dancing plague had not ended, but merely completed its initial phase, preparing for expansion into something far more comprehensive. As winter approached, Matthias sealed his manuscript in the monastery archives, hoping that future scholars might possess the knowledge necessary to understand what he had witnessed. The mystery of the dancing plague would endure long beyond the lives of those who experienced it, a testament to humanity's encounter with forces that operated according to laws not yet discovered and purposes not yet revealed. The dance had ended, but the music played on, silent, invisible, and eternally transformative.